The story begins with a loud phrase that the main character is hungry, and we see its huge mouth that greedily and appetitiously devouring a huge piece of meat. While the man is greedily eating his food, a thin boy with dark hair is standing behind him. He looks awkwardly and in surprise at the man who is enjoying his meal. He looks with an unpleasant look and thinks that he should not bite into this meat so shamelessly. He obviously doesn't like it, because now his stomach is rumbling too. Suddenly, someone shouts to him, "Why is he standing there doing nothing?" Was he trying to defame the name of House Blalak, one of the 5 great families? 2 more men in iron armor are standing next to him. A screaming man with green hair and a square pointing at the boy with his index finger. The boy bows his head and looks down, apologizing. A man in armor can't believe he's paying a salary to such an inept boy. Raphael pulls out the coins, twirls them between his finger and throws them at the boy. He shouts how it infuriates him. While the boy shivers after getting coins into his body, he tries to cover himself with a spear. He involuntarily bowed his head, trying to defend himself. Coins fall to the ground. Raphael asks what it is. Isn't he going to pick them up? He declares that he should thank him for this money. He falls to his knees and with restraining emotions, picks up these coins. He is told that, with mediocre skills, he takes the place of an honorary holy knight. The boy is already on all fours, collecting coins without looking up, and Raphael is still shouting that if this continues, he will face a fate worse than execution. Suddenly, these knights in armor hear some sounds similar to the rumbling of the stomach. They do not understand what these sounds are. Raphael and his comrades stand like a pillar. The girl is more surprised and does not believe that it was the same sound of a man's stomach rumbling. The second guy does not react in any way. Only Raphael is infuriated by this sound. Raphael starts to get angry, swings his leg, shouting that he behaves as if they don't feed him. He kicks this boy right in the stomach. The boy vomits from the blow. He lies on his stomach and some liquid is under him. A girl with long pink hair says he looks like a worm. Raphael puts his foot on the boy's head and shouts at him to get up. Now, he shouts at him to get up, otherwise he will be accused of poor gate surveillance. Suddenly, someone shouts at Raphael to stop doing it, the girl with long hair, and says that he will die and that such behavior is not befitting a holy knight. Raphael recognizes the girl and regretfully says that Roxy Hart is on shift today. The guys leave with anger and irritation, reminding them that they should be careful while standing guard. Raphael turns with a grin and looks at the boy. He looks up with fear. Roxy calls the boy Faith and asks if he's okay. She helps him up. He looks up and with such innocent admiration, I look at Roxy Hart, literally his savior. He's worried and can't believe it. Faith gets up and says that everything is fine and thanks her for helping him. She holds out her hand and says that it's not worth it. They are comrades, after all. Roxy Hart starts saying that if those people treat him like that again, then Faith interrupts her actively, waving her hands and saying that there is nothing and that everything is fine. Then he runs away in a hurry, saying that it's time for him. Roxy stays where she is surprised by Faith's unexpected behavior. While Faith was running away, at the same time, he was thinking that he didn't want Roxy to have problems because of him. He thinks she should follow her own path. He is walking among numerous people busy with their own affairs. Sunset is approaching. He goes and reflects that stale bread and thin soup are no good. They will hardly help him to get enough. His eyes are full of despair and sadness. In this world, everyone is born with a skill. Every person has it. It is a blessing that God rewards them with. But there are also those whom God has not blessed. The skill of our main character is gluttony. In simple words, it makes a person monstrously hungry. Faith considers herself superfluous in this world. He remembers about Raphael and the others, and thinks that, on the other hand, these guys are holy knights, just in their own strange way. They cannot be defeated in battle. He is sure that these guys will never leave him alone and will hurt him to death. He hopes that Raphael and his comrades do not offend his Roxy-sama. He wanders the streets, turning corners in every possible way. Eventually comes to the original place and sees Roxy, after which he smiles. He turns his head and sees several people climbing over fences and jumping down. He thinks they are intruders, because this is Roxy's blind spot. He thinks he should hurry up and warn her. He shouts her name. She is surprised and asks if he didn't go home. Faith shouts that they are in big trouble because some bandits have climbed over the eastern wall. Roxy asks if it's true. He confidently replies that it is true. There can be no doubt. Roxy closes her eyes as if thinking, and then she looks up and says she understands everything. She tells him to go there right away. She asks him to keep an eye on the gate while she is away. He gladly takes an iron stick from her hands and takes her place. When Roxy was already pulling out her sword and wanted to leave, Faith wishes her good luck with a very serious face. Roxy tells him to rely on her. She is sure that she can stop them. Faith looks at Roxy with a kind of regret in her eyes. In the dead of night, there is a lonely Faith. He notes that it has suddenly become so quiet. He is still standing at the door of the building, guarding it. He wonders if it's over, and then notes that Roxy's heart is really amazing. In the afterlife, silence, some sounds of drops are heard. These drops slowly and loudly fall to the ground, fresh blood that flows from a living person. Suddenly, he hears some footsteps. He thinks it's Roxy and turns to her with Joe, calling her name along the way. But it's not her. A man is crawling towards him without one limb, with a sword in his other hand. He's bleeding. He can barely walk himself. His eyes are filled with anger and rage. He calls Faith a small fry and shouts at him to get out of the way. Faith's face is full of horror and confusion about what to do. He turned pale with fear. He realizes that someone has slipped away from Roxy. After all, he remembers the joyful and beautiful Roxy who moves so actively in front of him and smiles that it becomes so warm inside. There is not a drop of darkness and evil intentions in it. His hands are shaking. He can't let it pass. He makes up his mind and confidently attacks with his spear. The spear plunges directly into the enemy's body. Faith lifts the spear and throws the enemy back. The enemy falls, crouching in pain. Blood flows from his mouth, and his eyes are so open that a little more and they will either burst or fall out of their sockets. Faith freezes in place, saying out loud that he did it. He holds tightly the spear with which he killed the enemy. Suddenly, he drops the spear. His gluttony has been activated. He feels as if everything inside is actively starting to move. The blood is rushing. He feels as if he is swimming in this river full of dark red liquid energy. Strength, will and dexterity are added to it. He doesn't understand what it is, what kind of feeling he is experiencing now. It was as if every part of his body was ready to absorb everything that was left of the enemy. He is interrupted from his thoughts by a voice calling his name. He opens his eyes abruptly, as if waking up from a deep and exciting dream. He sees Roxy running to him, asking if he's okay. It is clear from her that she is seriously scared and excited. She puts her hands on Faith's shoulders and asks if he's hurt. Roxy hesitantly says that she accidentally missed one of them and that he's kind of pale. However, these words were not spoken out loud. Only Faith hears it, presumably because of the acquired skill. He shudders violently and comes to reality. Of course, he is surprised, because he hears what Roxy does not say out loud at all. Roxy asks if something is wrong. He answers with hesitation that no, nothing happened. He awkwardly waves his hands, closing his eyes, and with a smile, says that he is really fine and that there is not a single scratch on him. Roxy sighs with relief, closing her eyes, and only takes his word for it, saying that she understood. Looking at Roxy's hands, he hears a voice saying that it's such a relief that nothing happened to him, and that she thanks and praises God for it. Faith doesn't understand what just happened. He examines himself, his body from the feet. Then he looks up and remembers about the enemy. He asks Roxy to pretend that she dealt with them. Roxy's face shows that she is scared to hear this. She begins to resist and worrying, saying that it's not fair because Faith also laid one. Faith doesn't speak directly, but replies that it's all thanks to her. He adds that if Raphael finds out about this, it will be quite problematic. He says this with a sigh, showing how disgusted he is with the thought of Raphael. Roxy is surprised at first by such a statement, and then, with a calm face, says that it's fine. She will do so. She says she understood him, so they will report the incident the way he suggested. Faith awkwardly bows to her, lowering her head and thanking her. Roxy, with a guilty expression on her face, says that she should thank him. After all, if he hadn't warned her, then she would have tarnished the name of the Hart family, so she asks to let him thank her properly. He waves his hand in panic again, saying that it's not worth it, and that accepting gratitude from the holy night is. He doesn't finish the thought, because he sees Roxy taking offense, blowing away her cheeks. Her eyes seem to tell him not to refuse and not to show off. Faith blushes a little and is surprised, opening her mouth slightly, realizing that she also makes such expressions. Roxy thinks, holding her index finger to her cheek, showing her diligent efforts to come up with something. After a second, she says she's made it up. He folds his pens in front of him and asks Faith why he shouldn't get a job in the Hart family. She winks, points her finger at him, and says that she is sure her father will take him if she tells about what happened today. He backs away and asks what she's talking about, because it's impossible. He clenches his fist and says that his skill is useless. Besides, there is a problem with the Blalock family. Roxy says he doesn't have to worry about it, and then he asks a provocative question. She asks if he is going to work for them for the rest of his days. When she asks this question, she looks at him with such a look as if she is ready to condemn him. He bows to Roxy, saying that, in that case, he can't wait to get to work with her. Roxy closes her eyes and smiles, glad that he agreed. He says, "It's great," and then adds that it's getting late, and that he should go home. He bows to her again. Roxy asks him to come to the Hart estate the day after tomorrow, at noon, and that she will be waiting for him. His eyes are already filled with tears. He thanks her again and again. Tears flow straight down to the ground when he tilted his head down when he thanked her. He can't believe how happy he is right now with Roxy's proposal. Deep at night, the moon shines, however, not with the usual white light giving the earth rays, but with a red light, as if filled with blood. There is a man standing on a small mountain. He has dark blue hair. His eyes also sparkle scarlet. If you look closer, you can see the main character, Faith. Next, we see Faith sleeping with her mouth open on a haystack in a normal, calm sleep. But he wakes up abruptly, his eyes wide open. He feels as if he had a very strange dream. He gets up and wonders if yesterday's events were definitely not a dream. There is one window in his room from which the rays of the sun come. He remembers to himself how Raphael and his comrades came to him, how Roxy herself with deep blue eyes came to replace him, and how he killed the enemy. A picture pops up where he is standing next to a corpse holding a spear with a flag, on the tip of which blood is also flowing now, but only the blood of the enemy. He remembers the voice and wonders, a kind of voice it was that he heard yesterday. He puts his hands in front of him, in a lock, and diligently starts thinking. It turns out that he was not remembering Roxy's voice, which spoke of relief and excitement, but about the voice of the system, which, without his will, voiced his achievements. When suddenly his data appears, his name is Faith Graphite, and that he is at level 1. His energy is 120 units, and his strength is 151, his will is 100, and his dexterity is 130. A certain window appears right in front of him. His eyes are wide open. He does not understand what it is because the indicators have become higher. He is even more shocked when he realizes that these are also 3-digit numbers, although all his characteristics should be less than 10. Then he calmly perceives the information that assessment and mind reading have also been added to his skills. He begins to understand and remember why he heard that voice when Roxy touched him last night. He heard her thoughts only because of a new skill. Next, we are again shown a mountain of corpses headed by Faith in a black skull mask. If we look closely, we can see that the corpses are goblins. By taking the souls of the slain, he can turn them into his own power. He has never felt something like this before. He feels satiated. He smiles. Now he understands what it was, and that, now that he knows everything, there is only one thing left. He already gets up at such a thought and clenches his fist in front of him from the rush of emotions. Some time later, he walks down the street of the Safe Heart shopping district. In addition to him, many more people wander the streets doing their own business. Faith walks through the streets looking at the citizens and all the houses that surround him. The houses are built with a maximum of 2 floors. They are all very compact in size. He takes out his palm where 2 coins are lying. All he had left were 2 silver coins. Of course, he understands this with great desperation. He reflects that if he wants to buy a gun, this place is his only option. He thinks he won't be allowed on the doorstep of high-end stores. While he was walking through the streets in search of a proper counter for him with weapons, suddenly, an old man at the counter asks him if he is looking for weapons. He smiles at him with all his might and treats him kindly. Faith tells him that he has read his mind. The old man kindly says that he wandered around looking at everything. He points to the product on his desk are very beautiful, new swords of different sizes and thicknesses. There are swords that even have silver or gold handles. Faith thinks he can get something here, so he says out loud that, of course, he agrees. The old man asks if he can find out what his budget is. He scratches the back of his head and awkwardly hesitates at first with his answer. And then he just holds out his palm where the 2 silver coins are lying. The old man looks at him sadly and with pity. Then he clicks and says with hatred that, after all, he turned out to be a pitiful poor man, and that he shouldn't have been so kind to him. He immediately changes his behavior. He becomes rude and ruthless to words. He already looks at Faith with hatred, who did not even do anything to him. He points to certain weapons and says that these wretched swords are the only thing he can afford. These swords look better and used more than once. The old man laughs out loud with his nasty laugh and tells Faith that they are perfect for him. Faith gets upset and goes to look further. Then he thinks again that most likely wherever he goes, the attitude towards him will be the same. He thinks that it is worth choosing a weapon in this shop. He goes to the swords that the old man pointed out. There are about a couple dozen of them distributed into dishes. Even the barrels themselves are battered and old. He bends down for the sword, but suddenly his eyes begin to activate and see some numbers on the swords. 2 of the swords had the number 10 on them, and the third had 11 on it. Then Faith realizes that it's really just a bunch of junk. He kneels down to be on a level with the swords and looks at them. Faith reluctantly closes his eyes and thinks that he would like to have at least thing useful here. He reaches out and grabs the sword, which is completely black, which was discussed at the very beginning. Suddenly, he hears a thought that asks to be bought. Faith immediately lets go of the sword and pulls away in shock. He is horrified, not understanding what it is at all and why this sword suddenly spoke like that. He is in shock. He sees a kind of energy emanating from the sword similar to smoke. The contours of the sword glow with blue fire, as if prompting and giving hints that this sword is really exactly what Faith himself came for. Faith doesn't understand. He heard that sword speak just now. The sword, by the way, is similar to the sword that is shown to us in the passage where he himself stands on a mountain of corpses. The old man gets a note and tells him to leave already if he is not going to buy anything. Faith turns around in horror and stares at the old man. He wonders if he's the only one who's heard it. He picks up the sword again and suggests that maybe it's him. After all, suddenly he heard again that it was interesting and that Faith had not run away. Faith looks at the sword and sees a dark aura emanating from it. He thinks he knew that the sword was talking to him through the mind-reading skill. He wonders if this sword is cursed or something like that. However, it does not look so unusual. He examines every part of the sword. He decides to check the indicators and sees how the window pops out as it is written that the name of the sword is Greed and its shape is a one-handed sword. Faith doesn't understand. If he can't see anything but the name and the form, he looks at the swords again and realizes that this sword is treated the same as him. He understands this with such despair and pity. All the swords in the barrel are disheveled and as if like small, unnecessary things beaten and thrown away after use. The sword suddenly asks what he has decided, and then asks if he will buy this sword. Holding this sword in his hands, he still feels it's dark magic. Faith reflects that he is the only one who looks at least a little acceptable. Then he tells the sword out loud that yes, he will take it. Faith takes a sword in her hand, picks it up, and says that he doesn't have any money anyway. And then smiles and tells him what he feels, namely, that they are similar. The sword says that this is fate and promises that it will accompany him until the end of his days. After such words, the sword asks its owner what his name is. Faith introduces herself, gives her name, Faith, Graphite. In turn, Faith asks the sword how to address him. He replies that his name is Greed and that Faith should actually be proud that he now owns it. It can be seen that the sword itself has a high opinion of itself. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted by that old salesman. He calls Faith a poor man and asks how much longer he is going to consider it. Faith himself begins to get angry and annoyed. He goes to the seller with an aggressive gait and a sword, and then he loudly puts those same silver coins. The old man wanted to start a scandal. He started shouting, when suddenly another visitor appears, and he smiles kindly again and says, "Welcome to him." Faith thinks to himself confidently that he will never set foot in this shop again. He leaves this counter very angry and offended. He walks back down the same street holding his sword tightly in his hands. He wrapped this sword in white material, of course, not all of it, but the part called the blade. He says he thinks he should hunt goblins nearby. The sword hears his owner and says that it is clear to him and that this is the most for a beginner. The sword notes that he should not get ahead of himself just because he now owns such a great weapon as this sword because goblins can crowd after all. Faith tells him that he knows. He remembers an old man asking to hear that goblins have one peculiarity. I told him about it once in a pub. It reaches the southern gate of the capital. He sees how many warriors are here. He wonders if they are gathering in this place before going hunting. He sees many warriors, knights in iron armor. They kindly communicate with each other, discussing the upcoming hunt. He reflects and thinks that an improvised squad can be assembled here. He thinks that it sounds good that you can have comrades. Suddenly, some guy in uniform calls out to Faith, waving his hand to get his attention. Faith turns her attention to him and turns her head to him. That guy asks if Faith is a warrior, and if he wants, they can form a squad. He says that his partner didn't come today. Faith asks with a happy smile if he is really serious. He says that everything is serious, and then asks what level he has. He confidently shouts that he has the first level. There was silence. People had already gone far away, including the guy who offered him a team. The sword calls him by name and says that it's better for him to give up this idea. He asks who would want to go with a person who has the first level. Faith sighs heavily, scratches the back of his head and says that he was just glad that he bought a sword. The sword says that this is the truth of life. In addition, he should not show other people his gluttony. Faith is surprised, asks to wait and asks how the sword could have found out about this. The sword answers him that the fact is that they are the same with him, and that he will probably understand everything soon, whether he wants it or not. Faith scratches his cheek and reflects that the sword is right. In his opinion, he should not tell others about this. After all, if they find out about him, they can kill him. Then he smiles and reflects that since he has this power, he can become so powerful that no one will dare to raise a hand against him. All of these reflections are accompanied by where Faith is in the black skull mask. Then he returns from his thoughts to reality and tells the sword out loud that it's okay. He's right. First he needs to hunt goblins. Faith comes to the south of the capital, the so-called Goblin Field. The goblins have declared this place their home. It's such a green field full of all kinds of trees. They attack every wagon that passes by and rob it. They just pounce on the carriages. The coachman simply does nothing in fear. Faith himself looks out among the bushes and watches the goblin. He happily thinks that he has found one goblin. The goblin he found is sleeping very soundly, not paying attention to what is happening around. He crawls on the grass and thinks that it seems there are no other enemies nearby, and this goblin is also sleeping. He moves carefully and quietly through the grass. Unexpectedly, he has an evaluation of this goblin. Thus we learn from the system that this goblin is a fighter and that he is at the 3rd level. His energy is 30 units and his strength is 40. Faith reflects that this goblin is a fighter. Judging by the name there are other species. Then he realizes that this goblin's indicators are lower than his indicators. The goblin himself does not even suspect anything. He sleeps in a sitting position with his legs folded in front of him, and his head is hanging involuntarily. Faith smiles looking at the goblin. He understands that he is completely open, and this is the best moment to attack. Faith makes up her mind and runs to the goblin with her sword. At the last moment, the goblin hears Faith approaching and wakes up, but it was already too late. Faith kills the goblin. His gluttony is activated, after which his stats increase. The system is updated and tells Faith that a power boost has been added to his skills, namely, a small one. Faith clenches her fist and rejoices that he has succeeded. Its data is updated and the window shows his characteristics. It says on the window that his energy is now 151 units. Strength is 191, magic and will are 111, and agility is 161. The following are his skills, mainly gluttony, evaluation, mind reading, and now also increasing strength. He sees this and rejoices that he is getting stronger. The sword tells him that you should not be so happy with the skill of the simplest goblin. Today will end. He will not have time to look back. Fate tells him that this is the first time. He doesn't think other warriors had it like that. But until today, he used to run away when there was danger. The sword already sighs and tells him that he understood everything. In front of them lies a goblin in the grass, bleeding without a head. Then he takes the goblin's ear with the sword and quietly puts it in the back because he remembers that if you take the ear, you can get money from the converter. He sits down and realizes that this is only 10 copper coins for a goblin. He hopes that he will be able to earn more than while working as a guard. And then he gets up, cheers up, and says that this is go and that we already need to start the next one. So now is not the time to hang up. He is still watching the terrain. He first sees one goblin in clothes and with a sword. The other has a shield. He is without outerwear. He thinks it may be a new species. He activates the rating system and sees that this goblin is a guardian and that she is level 3. Its energy is 40 units and its strength is 20. Magic will and dexterity are equal to 10. His skill is to boost energy. The sword itself analyzes and understands that this shield looks like a problem. Therefore, after much thought, he comes to the conclusion that he should probably start by attacking the goblin. But he understands that it will not be easy if he uses a shield. The sword informs him that he does not have much combat experience, so he would like to be sure that he will kill them. Fate holds the sword tightly and prepares. Goblins say something to each other. One pot-bellied man says something in his own language to another, who in clothes and with a sword answers him. They stand behind each other. Fate prepares for the attack and realizes that it's now or never. He pushes off from the ground and picking up speed, runs towards the goblins. The sound of rustling grass is heard. Fate takes a big step with a run. He encourages himself that it should be done now. Goblins hear it all and react to it immediately by turning their heads behind the sound. They manage to say something to each other. The other raises his shield. He has already jumped with a swing at the goblin, but Faith realizes that he screwed up because the goblin is going to block the blow. However, with one swing of his sword, he cuts this goblin. His gluttony is activated. Everything in Faith's mind turns red. The goblin does not have time to do something. He stands in shock, not understanding if he really cut the shield. He looks at the shield in surprise, not believing what just happened. He doesn't believe that the sword is so strong. The goblin does not have time to react and only waves his little sword up and down in fear, apparently trying to intimidate Faith with the sword. In the next second, Faith cuts this goblin without much effort. Apparently Faith was waiting for a new skill. He wonders if he didn't get the fighter's skill, so he checks his status by calling the system window. He raises his head to look at the characteristics. Now he realized that he could only possess one skill of each type. Of course, it upset him. Then it turns out that if he wants a new skill, he needs to hunt other monsters. He calmly examines the window and reflects, folding his hands. He evokes greed and asks why he was treated so badly, even though he is so amazing. The sword answers him that everything is simple and that he chooses the owner himself. Faith rejoices and asks if this means that he recognized him as a worthy owner of the sword. Faith smiles and thinks, even though he swears, but since the sword chose him as the owner, it must then meet his expectations. On a hot day, he puts a huge bag full of ears. He rejoices and says, this is a catch. He looks smilingly at the bag and says he doesn't know why, but he's lucky that all the goblins just appeared in front of him. Then he remembers and wonders what his status looks like now. He stands on the fresh green grass with a calm soul. The system shows a window where energy is now equal to 1371, and strength is 1451. Magic is 481, will is the same, and dexterity is equal to 1051. He can't believe it. However, he does not understand why the level does not rise. He comes to the conclusion that he should have gained quite a lot of experience. The sword tells him that he is one of the sacrilegious skills, and therefore he cannot receive the blessing of the sphere. Faith himself doesn't understand what the sword is talking about. The sword explains that gluttony is the act of stealing the characteristics and skills of other creatures while killing them. People like him don't get blessings from the gods. The sword tells him that the fact that at the beginning his indicators were equal to 1 is another proof of that. Faith listens to it all with her mouth open. The sword starts saying something else, and then changes his mind, says no and that he won't say anything. Fate takes offense and tells him to tell because he wanted to find out. The sword tells him that the sun has not set yet, so it's better for them to return to the capital. Faith raises her sword and begins to tell him, angrily, to listen to him. But suddenly the same sound is made. Faith's stomach is rumbling terribly. He calmly already tells the sword that, in his opinion, he is still right. He informs that he is hungry. He thinks that next time he will go to that forest. Faith walks away from this forest and thinks that next time he will try to fight the hobgoblin. On a sunny and bright day, a happy Faith with a bag walks down the village street. It passes through people who are busy with their own affairs. People calmly turn to each other with ordinary things talk. Faith goes the furthest and finds herself at the door. He finds himself in a place where two people are sitting and arguing with each other, almost reaching a conflict. One points angrily with his finger, and the other has already clenched his fist. On the other side, some people are really fighting. People are worried. He thinks that, of course, he has heard rumors, but the guild turned out to be a really harsh place for him. Someone is shouting that there is a fight somewhere. Suddenly, a man pushes Faith from behind. He angrily shouts that he should not interfere with him, and get out of the way. Faith awkwardly and guiltily apologizes to him. He's already panicking, holding the bag tightly in his hands. Faith hears the girl screaming for the next one to pass. Faith thinks with relief that it just coincided and that he doesn't need to figure it out. But now he comes up to the counter, holds out a bag with ears, and says with a smile that he would like to exchange this. He puts this bag on the counter and hands it to the employee. The woman suggests first to see what is there. She opens the bag and sees the goblin's ears cut off. She is surprised that there are so many goblin ears there. She asks him if they really hunted a large group of aggro. He hesitantly tries to answer something, but the woman understands and interrupts him. She explains that if you kill many identical monsters in one day on the hunt, then other representatives of this species will hold a grudge and start hunting them. Faith scratches the back of his head awkwardly, saying that if it's true, then he didn't know, because he's new. And he thinks to himself, for what reason there were so many monsters? The woman looks at him and says that he must be in rags, because he fought a lot. She praises him and calls it a great job. The sword laughs and says that this is actually his usual clothes. Faith tells him to shut up aloud, turning his head to the sword and clenching his fist. He hears how the girl does not understand what he is talking about and whether it is with her at all. Faith laughs awkwardly and waves her hands, speaking haltingly, which he just imagined. The woman walks away and tells him that she will then prepare his reward and he should wait for her a little. His stomach is rumbling again. He is thinking with a smile about what to buy him for dinner today. He hopes that he will be able to afford something satisfying. Suddenly, the sword calls him and says that it is very unpleasant for him to be so dirty. So that his Faith should clean it before dinner. He says again that we need to take good care of him after the battle, because it is as important to him as food is important to Faith. Here, Faith awkwardly thinks that he didn't even take the sword to the blacksmith right after the purchase. He scratches his head and suggests looking for a blacksmith nearby. After he has kept his word, he leaves the workshop and thanks the master. In the background, a man is rummaging in some boxes. Then he pulls out a small bag and realizes that in just half a day he has earned more money and he has saved in the last 5 years. He closes his eyes and is ashamed to think how pathetic these 5 years have been. He remembers Raphael with his comrades and all his bad deeds and words. Then he decides that he won't think about it, because he said goodbye to his past life. He clenches his fist and confidently declares that now he will look only to the future. The sword interrupts him and says that it's good that he thinks so in advance, but it will not be easy for him if he does not learn to take care of him himself. Faith, without hesitation, says that in his opinion, he is right. He's still walking down the street full of people. He says that there was not a scratch on the sword, and he does not want to give 10 copper coins every day to Faith at all. With all his thoughts, he carefully holds the sword. He remembers how the process of choosing a sword went through and how he spoke to him. He thinks that if he suddenly has to travel, he won't be able to visit the forge. Often, he says out loud that he understands everything and that he is going to buy blacksmithing tools after dinner. The sword tells him that he seems to have finally realized his greatness. Fate notes that he is indeed a proud weapon. That sword replies that this is true, of course, after all, because his name is Greek. Fate with the idea that he could afford a sumptuous dinner tonight, he comes to the conclusion that it must necessarily be meat. Besides, it must be the most delicious. He walks down the street and feels such a thick smell of fried meat. He understands that the smell comes from a certain door. He decides that they will have dinner here. Suddenly, he is pushed by a huge, overweight man who is leading a little girl. Faith falls and hits her back against the wall. That man rudely asks Faith where he's looking at all, calling him bad words. Faith also starts to get angry. How dare he call him that? The man pulls the girl by the hand and gives the order to get up immediately. Faith feels sorry for the girl. He wanted to stop her. He touches her shoulder. The next second, he sees the girl's exhausted and offended face full of tears. He reads her thoughts with the help of his power. She asks him to save her with long hesitations. Faith is surprised that he could hear such thoughts of hers. He looks after this man, aggressively dragging that little girl behind him, tearfully asking him to save her. He freezes in place with his eyes and mouth wide open. He holds out his hand, not realizing at all that it just happened at all. He wonders if this man is not her father. He doubts if this is a kidnapping at all. He does not understand who he is at all. A window with red information opens in front of him as if warning that he is dangerous in himself. His name is Cos Black, who is on level 15. His stamina is 920 and his strength is 900, magic is 670 and will is 500. However, his skill icon is empty. Faith is surprised that this man has no skills. He thinks it's impossible, because everyone is given a skill at birth. The sword tells him that it must be a concealment skill. He does not understand and asks again. The sword tells him that, as the name implies, it hides the skills of the owner, which is why he can't see them. Then the sword asks him what he will do. Now, Faith makes a face, showing that it is difficult for him to decide and take something. Now he doesn't understand what he's talking about. The sword tells him that he has seen his stats and that this man is a warrior. There is a dark energy emanating from this man. The sword tells him that his stats are a little higher, but it focuses his attention on his eyes. Because he has the eyes of a killer, the man's eyes are full of rage. Faith is wary of such information, and immediately thinks that he is going to kill that girl. He thinks that the sword should not only talk about killing this girl. Faith exhales and says that the food can wait. He offers the sword to go after them. The sword is surprised and asks if he really wants to save her. Faith confidently begins to walk, and courageously says that she can't pretend that everything is fine when she knows that something is wrong. The sword asks him to let him give advice. He stops. The sword tells him that he should not show mercy to people who are ready to die, and then he asks if he understands it. Faith follows this man and the girl. He answers the sword that he understands everything. He reflects that no matter how evil a person is, he does not think it is right to take his life. He is not a hero and does not want to be one. It is strange that a man is roughly dragging a girl after him, but not a single resident of this area will turn his head in their direction and try to stop him. He confidently walks with heavy thoughts that if someone is suffering right in front of his eyes, then he definitely wants to help. He keeps walking and watching that man, and eventually they come to some kind of shed. Faith is standing around the corner and does not understand what they are doing in such a place. The guy notes that this man has a sword hanging on his belt. The sword tells him, saying that it's just guesswork, but perhaps the worst can happen. Faith says it all sounds bad. He quietly looks through the window into this building and sees how the girl is chained to the wall, and this bald man with a smile is standing in front of her. Faith immediately thinks that this is really a kidnapping. The man says he loves working with children because they immediately become so obedient. It's only worth scaring a little, he says. It's such an easy job. He shouts to her if she knows that her parents abandoned her, and then adds that he even almost sympathizes that she has such a useless skill. After these words, a second later, her eyes close in tears. It hurts her to listen to such words. Through the window, Faith watches this picture and sees the back of a poor girl who is lying exhausted on her side. His mouth opens wide in shock. He remembers himself as a child when other children threw stones at him and laughed at him, while he lay on the ground and trembled with fear. No one helped him. Then he starts to get really angry. Clenching his teeth, the sword tries to bring him to himself, telling him to calm down, otherwise he won't have a chance against this man. Faith keeps hearing the man calling her a pathetic girl. He throws his arms to the side laughing, says that no one will help her. Then he turns to her and asks if she is not happy about such events. She actively waves her head to the side, as a sign of denial. Then the man takes her by the hair and lifts her face up, telling her to be a good girl, otherwise he will just take and kill her. Screaming at the top of his voice, he asks her if she understands what he just said. Faith wanted to climb through the window and stop this injustice. He wanted to shout already, not to be silent about this, but the sword tells him to stand and wait some more. Faith resists and angrily wanted to say something, but the sword interrupts him and tells him not to be led by emotions, otherwise he will die. Faith is barely holding on so as not to break in there. He moves away from the window and diligently thinks about what he should do. The sword reminds him that this man has much more experience. He continues to reassure and explain that he may be killed. Now, Faith exhales, saying that he understood everything and that he would pull himself together whether this would suit the sword. He looks in the window again and wonders if there's really nothing he can do. He sees the boxes and thinks he can use them as a shelter and get closer. While he was thinking it all over, the sword informs him that the man is leaving. Indeed, the man opens the door and goes into another room. Jumping through the window, he realizes that the girl is now left alone, and this is the best moment to save either now or never. In a moment, Faith is next to this girl and tells her that he came to save her. He pulls out his sword and tries to control his expression. He cuts these chains with his sword that they just break apart with a bang. The girl informs him that she is fine, carefully examining her hands. Faith says that then she will go with him, and that they need to get out of here. The girl is so happy that tears have flowed from her eyes. Faith seriously asks if she can mock at all, but in the next moment, the girl's face is filled with fear at the sight of that man behind Faith. She already freezes. The man says that this happens from time to time. This man says some noble idiot comes to the rescue, and then he kills this potential savior in front of these brats. Faith abruptly turns to face him. The man pulls out his sword. Faith spreads her arms as if protecting and guarding the girl with her whole body. Faith pulls out her sword and confidently holds herself in front of him. While the girl at the wall panics and trembles with fear, the man tells him to shout properly. He confidently walks towards them with his sword raised. He keeps talking and saying that it looks like a moth, and then without remembering the phrase, he says that it doesn't matter anymore. The girl was freed from the chains. Faith is holding her hand tightly. He also holds his sword in an upright position, preparing for an attack. Faith realizes that it was a trap and that he fell for it. He's already grinding his teeth with nerves and excitement. The formidable man says how pious Faith is. He calls him a stupid boy because he himself came into the clutches of death. Faith, holding the sword, begins to tremble with fear, and the man adds that he does not mind that he came to him himself because he was just in the mood to have fun. He encourages himself and orders himself to pull himself together. Now the man sees how Faith is afraid of him, and asks why Faith can barely stand on her feet. Faith thinks it's too dangerous to fight while he's protecting the girl, but rushing is too bad, an idea for him. The sword tells him to take the girl and run away. Faith looks at the sword for a second, directing all his attention to it. He wants to argue with this decision, but the sword reminds him what they just did. Faith does not think long and remembers how he broke the chains that were chained on the hands of this poor girl with one blow of the sword. He gains confidence and understands what this sword was talking about just now. He abruptly takes the girl by the hand and drags her along, shouting that they need to go in a certain direction. This bald man tells him that he will regret that he decided to contact him. As a result, Faith and the girl find themselves in a dead end, surrounded by numerous boxes. He covers the girl with one hand and with the other hand confidently holds a sword in front of him. A man finds them anyway and says calmly and at the same time menacingly that everything their catch-up is over and that they have nowhere else to run. Faith does not react to the words of the enemy in any way and tells the girl that she should keep away from him because it is dangerous here. The girl hears this and moves away from him. Faith grips the sword tightly, thrusting it forward. The man, as if laughing, asks if he had time to pray one last time before his death. Faith, again, does not answer anything, and just stands excitedly and waits for the moment. Suddenly, the sword tells him that he needs to act right now. Faith holds a sword with both hands and swings straight at the man, screaming. The crazy man laughs at the fact that he attacks him and calls him a fool. He defends himself from the sword of greed, but in the next second, the opponent's sword shatters into two pieces. The bald man does not even have time to react as Faith strikes a second blow, cutting the enemy in the stomach. The last thing he has time to say is that this is impossible. He falls face down, hit by a single blow from Faith. Half of the blade of his sword lies on the floor. The sword tells Faith that he did a good job provoking him. The provocation was that Faith and the girl had to move away from him. Faith raises her sword and proudly tells him that it's all thanks to his hint. He praises him and says he doesn't know what kind of sword he is, but he can cut through anything. After a short praise, Faith turns her attention to her enemy and orders him now to tell who this holy knight he works for is. And then he shouts that if he does not answer him himself, then he will just take and read his thoughts. He just groans in pain. He reads his mind, where he pronounces the name of Hadu Blalak. He freezes in motion, grabbing him by the collar. Faith reflects and can't believe that such a person is doing something so terrible. He convinces himself that Hadu and then changes his mind and says that not only he, but everyone, including Raphael and his comrades, one day, they will all pay for it. The next second, his gluttony is activated. Faith stands with her mouth open in shock. Concealment and the art of a sharp blade are added to his skills. The sword says he can't even believe that Faith is so surprised by such a simple technique. Faith blushes and tells him to shut up. Faith reflects that he is glad that the enemy did not have time to use this skill, because if this had happened, but then it would not be a bald man lying on the floor now, but him. His thoughts are interrupted again by the same rumbling sound of his stomach. The girl was already worried that her stomach behaved like this in such a situation. Faith laughs, walks up to her and bends down. He puts his hand on her head and strokes her, saying that everything is clear to him and that she is probably hungry. Even he is hungry in the dead of night, in a diner, on the sign of which such devices are painted like a fork and a knife. They serve such delicious and appetizing food. On the table is a plate of hot soup, made from large pieces of meat and vegetables, such as potatoes, carrots, and broccoli. A girl and Faith are sitting at the table, each with their own portion. Faith smiles at her and tells her not to be shy. The girl already drooled from such an appetizing meal. With a trembling hand, she picks up a spoonful of soup, with a large piece of meat, presents it to her mouth and eats it. Her eyes just start to glow with joy in the taste of this soup. Her cheeks are pink and stuffed with food. Faith decides to eat too and says she is starving. The girl eats in a hurry, enjoying every spoonful of soup. They have dinner together, stuffing their bellies. They go out on the street late at night. After questioning Faith, found out that this girl was from a rundown orphanage in the slums where he also lives. He stops, squats down. He strokes her and says it's time for them to say goodbye. Then he asks if she can walk home by herself. The girl says something he does not hear and asks, "What is it?" Then he sees how a happy and joyful girl calls him brother and says thank you to him. Faith freezes as if fascinated by her grace and childish beauty. He thanks her in return. She happily runs off to the nuns, waving after him. Those nuns happily come out to meet her. Faith waves back, modestly. Going back, he walked through the slums. After a long silence, the sword tells him that he has a strange expression on his face. What is the matter? After a pause, he replies that everything is fine and that he just thought he had a long way to go. Then Faith shares with him her worries that the very thought that tomorrow he will go to Roxy's estate worries him very much. He exhales very hard. The sword asks him if he is already nervous. Faith is surprised by such questions and asks the sword if he even knows that her family belongs to the 5 great ones. And then he excitedly and angrily says how carefree he is. The sword laughs and says that, but how else, because it's just a weapon. After a second, scratching the back of his head, he remembers and wonders what he should wear tomorrow. He's panicking now, because right now, all the shops are already closed. A hot summer day, soft clouds are flying in the blue sky. They do not knock down the rays of the sun. Because of the heat, everything seems to float before my eyes, creating glare. We see Faith pulling on her sleeves, apparently, her new clothes. His clothes fit him well and look fresh, as if they had just been ironed or made. He says it's good and asks if he wouldn't embarrass Roxy Hart like that. He's wearing new clothes now. The sword answers his question that it will not disgrace him, and then adds that even he can look good in suitable clothes. Faith is angry at the joke. He reflects that a lot has happened in the last 2 days. He remembers how he killed an enemy. How Roxy Hart invited him. These events were like a dream for him. He comes to the building and stops at the big doors, which are guarded by 2 knights. He is surprised at how huge their estate is. Approaching one of the knights, he thinks what to expect from one of the 5 great families. To begin with, he asks for forgiveness. He introduces himself and gives his name Faith, Graphite, and then says that he has an appointment with Roxy Hart. The knight looks at some notebook and says that he sees his last name. Then this knight asks Faith to follow him. They enter through the doors, and Faith sees a huge building with a red roof. He admires the fact that there is also such incredible beauty behind the fence. He looks around and realizes that it's pretty quiet here. He sees a beautiful garden full of trees, grass, all kinds of greenery and fragrant flowers. He thought there would be a lot of people. He obediently follows the knight. He thinks why there are no people. The only thing that comes to his mind is that everyone is working now. They get closer to the building and see Roxy Hart standing at the windows. She is waiting among the bushes full of roses, and among them, she looks like the most beautiful and valuable flower. The knight tells her that he has brought her guest. Roxy Hart turns to them and sincerely thanks him for just coming to her. Faith opens her mouth in admiration and surprise. He begins to blush, and in his head, there is a comparison of that courageous Roxy Hart in the service. Roxy Hart asks him if something is wrong. He waves his hand in panic and hesitantly says, with hesitation, that no, it's all right. With a trembling voice, he adds that Roxy Hart is so beautiful that he was surprised. She begins to blush from such compliments, and her eyes widen in surprise. She says, laughing and closing her eyes, that even she likes to wear dresses from time to time. He puts his hand on his heart and says that she barely recognized him either. Faith scratches the back of her head, blushing even more that Roxy Hart has noticed his new clothes. Suddenly, Roxy Hart stops laughing and smiling. From this reaction, Faith also stops smiling. Roxy Hart suggests he go further. They walk along the building, through a path surrounded by rose bushes. Faith wonders if they won't go inside because the door to the building is far behind. After a while, they stop, and Faith is surprised. He sees a pillar with an inscription, and in front of it is armor. Apparently, this is someone's coffin. There were white flowers at the monument. Roxy Hart says her father walks up to the coffin and leaves flowers for him. She says that today she is taking this man into service, and that their house will come to life again. Faith is still standing behind him and looks at what is happening with shock, not quite understanding the situation, what Roxy Hart herself is doing. Roxy Hart says out loud that it's only been 5 days since they found out about his death in Gaul. Faith, as if not understanding what she is talking about, says this name out loud. The sword tells him that this is a continent south of the capital, captured by monsters. They are extremely strong. Even the monsters here are not comparable to them. Faith reflects, if the news was 5 days ago, then it means that he died on the eve of the day, and she was guarding the gate. He understands that she kept such pain inside her. He returns to reality and hears the voice of Roxy Hart, who says that the main duty of the Holy Knight is to fight the monsters that have taken over Gaul. Faith ponders and does not believe that it is really possible to fight such strong monsters. Suddenly, Roxy Hart gets up from her knees and says that, however, her father did not die at the hands of a monster. Faith is surprised and asks what it means. Then Roxy Hart asks if he has ever heard of Goliath's belly disaster, turning to him here. The sword does not understand himself and asks if she is talking about a heavenly dragon. Faith hears and also does not understand what kind of heavenly dragon she is talking about. The sword says that this is a creature that is put at the same time with earthquakes and floods. They say it is impossible to stop it, no matter how strong a person is. Roxy Hart says that it looks like a heavenly dragon suddenly appeared and destroyed the entire army commanded by her father. There has not been a single case like this for decades. She adds that after her father's funeral and inheritance today, she is finally resting. There is silence. Roxy Hart smiles, looking down. Her hair is blowing in the wind. Faith is worried and says that, for some reason, Roxy Hart looks so weak with that bitter smile on her lips. He sees an indecisive Holy Knight. His inner voice, deeply hidden, insists that he must become stronger, so as not to let her down. Roxy Hart tells him that from now on Roxy Hart will raise the status of the family. Then she looks up at Faith and asks if he will help her. He says, with all his manhood, that here in front of her father's grave, he swears that he will do everything for this. They stand directly in front of each other, looking into each other's eyes. Roxy Hart calls him by name and thanks him for the oath and promise. There is a dilemma going on inside Faith. He keeps repeating in a terrible voice that this is not enough and that more is needed for him. He needs more food. Faith is lying and sleeping in a soft bed with clean, fresh linen. There is a window by his bed, so the sun shines on him at dawn. Suddenly, he wakes up open, his eyes, and immediately straightens up. He pulls his arms up to stretch for cheerfulness. The rays of the sun immediately envelop him. He smiles, looking at the street through the window, and says that this is another wonderful day. On the street, he meets another worker and bows to him, who wishes him good morning and asks if he slept well. He also greets and says that he is ready to work. Next comes the process of the work itself. People explain to Faith, pointing to a piece of paper what needs to be done. He is holding a box of tools and various scissors. A worker is cutting leaves on a large tree, and Faith is sitting cutting bushes. He works carefully and tries to make everything look smooth and fresh. He reflects with a sweet smile in the process of work that he has tried himself in different jobs, but gardening, in his opinion, suits him the most. He finishes with the work. Now, everyone looks neat and well-groomed. He looks at the tree and thinks that sooner or later, this big tree will need to be pruned. In the deep dark of the night, all the workers gathered for dinner. There are fresh loaves of bread on the table, a couple for each person, delicious meat as well as vegetables. Faith sees her dinner out as huge meat is covered with sauce, and is glad that meat is for dinner. Today, one of the workers with a mustache jokingly says that Faith turns out to be a real glutton. The girl asks, "What's the big deal here?" Because the main thing is that he eats well. Faith begins to eat, presenting a piece of meat in his mouth and chewing appetitiously. He thinks that it's like he's in another world where Raphael and other knights don't swear at him. Everything seems so good, but one thing is strange for him. He eats meat, he feels something is wrong, he feels hungry, and does not understand why this is so. He remembers and realizes that it looks just like the first time. Then, after thinking about it, he realizes that the current feeling of hunger is even worse than the last time. He stubbornly thinks about why he feels this way. He didn't hear anyone calling him, because he was deep in his thoughts. When he was called the second time, he heard his name and immediately raised it to his head in fright. Turns out his name was Roxy Hart. He sees her looking at him with empathy and concern. She tells him that he's kind of pale, and then asks if he's working too hard. She stretches out her hand to him to make sure that everything is fine with him. Faith immediately thinks that no, she can't touch him. He abruptly raises his hands and waves them, saying that he is fine. And then for authenticity, he repeats. The next second, Faith shivers. He feels as if he is in a stuffy space drenched in blood. He begins to feel dizzy and very hungry. The next moment, he falls off the chair and loses consciousness completely. Roxy Hart is horrified that Faith abruptly lost consciousness. Faith feels a feeling inside herself, perfectly describing the feeling of hunger. The emptiness that is inside him, it feels like it could all swallow him up. He wakes up and immediately breaks away from the bed. He realizes that he was so hungry that he lost consciousness. He wonders what is happening to him. He turns around and sees a note on the nightstand. He takes a piece of paper and sees that the letter is from Roxy Hart, who asks him to take a day off tomorrow and rests. He rubs his forehead and thinks bitterly. Why, of all people, he fainted in front of Roxy Hart. He looks out the window and realizes that there is no sun. The sky is enveloped by many stars, and the area is illuminated by a bright and cold moon. He realizes that he has been asleep all day. He ponders everything at night, and then asks the sword if he thinks it's strange. He adds that he has never experienced such hunger before. He asks what the sword will say to this, and the sword answers briefly and vaguely that it's too late and that the die has already been cast. But Faith doesn't understand anything. Then the sword tells him that the more souls his skill absorbs, the stronger it becomes, and now that gluttony has become a taste, there is no stopping it. Faith's mouth dropped open in shock. He will always want more. The sword says he's unusually hungry. After all, without waiting for an answer, the sword says that this is a mode of exhaustion. Faith doesn't understand what this exhaustion means. What it means, the sword asks to be allowed to show and tells him to look in the mirror. He looks in the mirror and realizes that his eyes are scarlet. He is enveloped in horror and fear. The sword says that red eyes are a sign that he is in exhaustion and that it will get worse and worse until he dies. Faith turns pale. The sword says again what it said earlier. There is no turning back. Faith, with a loss of hope and despair, asks, what will happen if he does not absorb other souls? What the sword says next is just awful. He says that he will either starve to death, falling to the floor, bleeding, or end up killing others. Faith begins to tremble. Sweat flows from him. He says convulsively that, no, this can't be. He goes down. His eyes run to the sides. He freezes, not knowing what to say. The sword concludes by saying that it can't take any more. He can continue to enjoy life as a servant, but let him not forget that he will not come back, right? The die has already been cast. Next, we are shown how Faith dresses in a dark uniform, covering his entire body, a bunch of belts on his stomach and hands rough gloves. With a sword he runs out into the street on a dark night, passing through the gate. He is running through the streets in fear and panic on this dark night. He opens his mouth, gulping air, greedily, continues to run. He's breathing hard and says he's in so much pain. But he's not tired, he's just too hungry. He takes a breath and sharply feels some kind of smell in soft, pink shades. He absorbs this smell and notes that it smells so delicious. He goes out through the gate and meets the knightsman who guards them. Faith doesn't see or feel anything except for the most alluring smell. They ask him if he is alright. It seems to him that Faith is in pain. Faith could barely walk with his head down. When he feels the fullness of this smell, he abruptly raises his head, showing his hungry red eyes. The knight is already screaming in fright. The other knight does not have time to ask what happened, as he immediately gets scared himself. Faith restrains herself and says that they work well. He shows a piece of paper left by Roxy Hart, and the knights are just pale to the point of horror. Remain in place. He goes outside the manor and wonders what it was just like when he was near the knights. It was as if he had returned to his consciousness. The sword tells him that it's all about his red eyes. He informs him that if someone is weaker than him, they automatically become prey for him. Faith began to understand what it had just been. He wondered if he had seemed too suspicious to those guards. The sword calms him down and says that everything is fine. Meanwhile, two guards are discussing. One asks what he just dreamed. The second agrees and says that he is just tired, that's why such visions. The sword tells Faith, if anything, they were more suspicious of his dodgy behavior. Faith awkwardly says that, in his opinion, the sword is right. It goes through a lot of people who are having fun that night. Then Faith begins to feel that intoxicating smell again. His eyes light up brightly again. He barely walks among people, and with a shiver in his body, thinks, why it smells so delicious here. The sword asks him, what now? Faith follows the men in black raincoats and realizes that the delicious smell comes from the three that go ahead of him. You can tell by their open legs that they are knights. They're all wearing black cloaks, and it looks like they're trying to hide from someone. Faith lets many people pass by her and resolutely decides to follow the same trinity. They really give off a very delicious smell. Apparently, the trio realized that someone was following them. They stop. Then Faith is shocked. He understands that it is Raphael and his other comrades. The same girl with pink hair, an indifferent Thur, and Raphael himself with a nasty green square. They looked at him first, but then they pretended they didn't know him and moved on. The next moment they turned the corner. Faith doesn't understand what they're doing or why they're sneaking around. He wonders if they also have such suspicious clothes. He doesn't think they have good intentions. He keeps watching them as they secretly go somewhere. He thinks that, after all, they are holy knights. He wonders what they are up to. Then he feels terrible hunger again. He sadly lowers his head and thinks that he would like to follow them more. But now is not the right time. He starts running because he needs to satisfy his hunger sooner. He comes to a place full of people, probably warriors. They are standing with weapons and different armor. He looks at certain people and thinks that those guys also give off a delicious smell. Faith's face is still pale and tired. The sword tells him that most likely, they are going on a night hunt. The moon is shining brightly today, so their target is sleeping monsters. Faith swallows, opens her mouth, breathing heavily, and realizes that he needs to hurry. Other people pay attention to him. One asks if he hunts alone, and then calls him a stupid guy. Another adds that his equipment is worthless and that no one will run to save him, whether he understands it. The third one says, what a pity it is, and then asks laughing if Faith wants them to go with him. Then all the guys start laughing. Faith, as if he does not hear them, he is worried about his exhaustion, acute hunger, which clouds his mind. The hunt begins. He kills goblins with great speed and desire. They don't even have time to make a sound before they die. He kills the first. Blood flows. Then he kills the second. Then the third, and so on. But no matter how many there are, it's too little for Faith. He needs even more. He waves his sword to the sides, easily killing all the goblins. His eyes have already gone berserk. He can't hear or see anything around. He's hungry, terribly hungry. More goblins appear on his way. They were talking to each other, but with one swing of the sword, he decapitates all the goblins standing in his way. There are dead goblins lying in this forest pierced by swords. Faith is standing in the center, recovering his breath. He feels that the hunger has subsided, but only a little. He exhales. He raises the sword to himself to see the reflection. He says that gluttony has consumed many souls, but his eyes are still red. He wonders how much more he needs to eat in order for the exhaustion to stop. The sword thinks at first and then says that it doesn't look like goblins will be enough for him. Faith says that then you need to hunt somewhere else. He says he feels stronger than usual, but he does not finish the thought, as the sword tells him that it is because of exhaustion. Like red eyes, increased strength helps gluttony to get enough. He looks towards the thick of forest and thinks about hobgoblins. Rumor has it that these are goblins who went to live in this forest after evolution. There are 3 types of hobgoblins. These are fighters, guards and archers. He will easily deal with fighters and guards, in his opinion, but archers will already be a problem for him. There are cases knights died from archers, since they have long-range vision weapons, especially since the arrowheads are covered with their own waste. Faith is glad that one of the servants taught him this. He would never have thought that he would meet it so soon. He goes further into the forest and meets 2 hobgoblins enjoying sleep, lying on the ground by a tree. He is evaluating the enemy. In front of him lies a hobgoblin fighter. His endurance is 230 strength, his 340 magic, his 110 just the same with will, and his dexterity is 230 and his skills include the possession of a 2-handed sword. Faith thinks about his skill. He points his gaze at the second hobgoblin, who is the guardian. Here's an interesting skill. He is increasing endurance at an average level. Approaching the goblin, he mentally asks for forgiveness. The next second, the goblin loses his head. From such a nose, the second goblin wakes up. He manages to shout something which Faith notices and thinks, is he really calling for help? If that's the case, then he won't allow it. So he inserts his sword right into his mouth. His gluttony is activated to his skills are added an increase in endurance at the intermediate level and possession of a 2-handed sword. Faith is feeling better. He leaves the goblins behind him and decides to continue his hunt, going further into the thick of the forest. Some time after hunting, he counts his prey and finishes 45. Then he abruptly realizes that he is no longer hungry, and besides, the red eyes have disappeared. The sword tells him that the exhaustion seems to have stopped. Faith holds on to the tree, exhales with relief because it's finally over. He says he wants to take a break. The sword advises him to climb a tree then, because there may be other goblins roaming around. By that time, he no longer has the gain that this exhaustion gives. Faith conceives and says that the sword is right. He jumps up a tree and says that in any case, he has definitely killed enough monsters to satisfy exhaustion. The sword says that he probably already realized that it's not that easy to satisfy him, and if he doesn't want to attack someone, then he needs to hunt monsters regularly. Lying on a huge branch of a faith tree, this thought does not rejoice. He says that he will hunt because he does not want to experience such hunger anymore. He comes to the conclusion that it's time to go back, then he hears a terrible sound. He gets scared and doesn't understand what it just happened. He looks down and sees a huge hobgoblin dragging a victim that is a human, drooling from his mouth. He himself is much larger in size than those with whom Faith fought. He makes loud and scary noises. Faith covers her mouth in disgust, realizing that this is really a simple man who went hunting. He reflects that ordinary people do not enter the hobgoblin forest, which means that this is one of the guys he saw the day before. He remembers those 3 warriors. He thinks that they were pretending to be big shots, and in the end, they died so stupidly. He looks at this monster to assess its abilities. It turns out to be the Goblin King, who has all the skills, several times higher than other goblins. His skills also include regeneration. He is surprised to find out that this is the Goblin King. He has heard that he is called the boss of this forest, and now he understands why he was so called. He reflects that such a meeting is probably very rare. His stats got higher as he absorbed a lot of souls. He wonders what he should do. Faith decides and descends from the tree and follows this king to see where he goes. Finally, the Goblin King comes to such a place full of flowers, sits down by a tree and is about to start eating. Faith is watching all this hiding behind another tree. He covers his mouth so he doesn't throw up. The sword asks him if he was really scared, because it's obvious that it wasn't worth waiting for another one. Faith sits down and wanted to say something. The sword tells him that he is sure Faith knows perfectly well what happens to people who die at the hands of monsters. Faith tells him that he understood, so the sword cannot continue. He knew, he just had never seen it with his own eyes before, even though he knew that monsters eat people. But to see such a big shock in person, he gets serious and then decides that it's time. He sneaks up quietly from behind without making a sound. The sword tells him not to hurry. He agrees and obeys. He walks slowly to the tree and raises his sword. The sword gives him the command to attack. Faith immediately obeys and hits the goblin boss in the shoulder with a swing that he bleeds. Faith immediately walks away, thinking that he has succeeded. The sword tells him not to relax, because he is alive. The crazed monster raises his bat and swings at Faith with a scream. Faith's eyes are full of fear and horror. The sword abruptly calls Faith by name and tells him to move away. He obeys and jumps back easily, lifting off the ground. The embittered Goblin King without one arm hits the ground with his bat as Faith himself has moved away. Faith covers herself with her hands. Even flowers fly to him. After that blow to the ground, he understands that it was very close. He is about 2 meters away from the monster. A dark energy emanates from the Goblin King, which indicates that he is furious. The monster roars, mouth wide open, that the entire cavity of his mouth is already visible. The sword warns Faith that he is still in danger, so he will go at him again right now. He raises his bat, at which point Faith is right in front of him and under the bat. But as soon as the monster lowers the bat with a blow, Faith jumps and moves further away each time. The monster does not give up and attacks Faith again and again. Not giving him a break from jumping, the monster growls even more, and his evil mood is visible on his furious face. He stops for a second, breathing heavily. Faith understands that he is so strong, and of course, if he falls under this cloud, he will definitely die. He sees the Goblin King tightening his grip on the club. Faith begins to be afraid and wary, but the sword says that a club is generally allowed, so the sword asks Faith to trust him. With an exhale, Faith abruptly jumps off the ground and shouts that he trusts the sword. The goblin sees this and attacks Faith with a growl too. But in the next second, the monster loses its balance and falls back from the fact that Faith's sword pierced its body. Faith made a confident punch, gritting his teeth and overcoming his fear. He does not stop at one blow followed by a second, which deprives the monster of a second hand. The Goblin King is just growling from the pain and hatred that Faith has caused him. He can't do anything because he doesn't have any hands anymore. But in the next second, Faith decides to finish off the monster and plunges her sword right into the mouth of the monster, which had been growling so much in pain before the monster starts falling backwards. Faith's gluttony is activated. The system notifies that regeneration has been added to his skills. He lowers his sword and calmly exhales, saying that he has succeeded. He sits down on the ground and looks at the sky. The sword tells him that it was a great job. Then the sword suddenly adds that it should be enough to unlock his first rank. Faith doesn't understand what he's talking about and asks what first rank he's talking about. The sword tells us that it can take on other forms. Faith wonders how many points he needs for this. The sword replies that it's all he's earned since their first meeting. Faith didn't like that number. He says it's so much. The sword says that taking everything is its nature. Then he adds that if Faith does not unlock the first rank, then he will lose the right to own it. It gives him the right to choose what he really wants. There is silence and Faith looks at the sword lying next to her. Then Faith asks with a smile how greedy he is for strength, and then adds that he doesn't even need to think. He picks up a sword, raising it in front of his face, and proudly says that he is his only partner. The sword proudly says that he will definitely not regret his choice, and then he offers a bright idea, which is that they stick together. Everything turns golden and bright. Faith is a little startled by the surprise. He already covers his eyes because it becomes so bright that everything blinds his eyes. The magic power envelops first the sword and then Faith himself. The sword begins to float in the air. Faith lets it go, and just looking at it, admires the sight. On this dark night, everything becomes so bright that it seems that morning has already come, and everything is enveloped by the dawn from the warm sun. The system window opens in front of Faith, where it says that he is still at the first level, but his indicators have increased several times. He is surprised by such large numbers, and cannot believe that this is the new him. The sword also changes and says that this is true and that it now has a new shape. now turns out to be a bow, a new form of magic bow. The sword tells him that now he will help him in two aspects at once. He looks at his new bow and smiles softly and tenderly. He thinks and wants to say something, but the sword ahead of his thought says that there are still second and third rank, but they will need a lot of characteristics. Here the sword pretends to have missed something important. Faith, frightened, asks, "What is it?" The sword sharply replies that there is something behind it. Faith manages to turn around and sees something flying at him. He manages to dodge and the spear flies a few centimeters away from him. The sword warns him that they are all aiming at him. Faith looks around in fear and tries to find the source of the arrows. The sword screams to him that another arrow is flying. Faith reacts quickly enough and immediately lies down on the ground so that the arrow flies over him at a small distance. Faith is right next to the slain Goblin King. He hides behind his huge body. Crouching down, he looks around, not understanding at all where they are all. The sword tells him to try to aim at them. The sword says that, thanks to its new shape, it only needs to know their location roughly. Faith doesn't understand and asks, "What about the arrows?" He replies that they materialize from Manhwa. Faith understood what was what, and immediately applied to use it. He concentrates and the arrow hits right into the head of this goblin. That he immediately shouts something in his native language, but it is clear that he is screaming in pain. Faith exhales calmly and happily that he has succeeded. He approaches the slain goblin and sees that he is lying face down with an arrow in head, which is shining brightly. All the power and characteristics of the killed goblin are transferred to greed. It looks like the onion absorbs and attracts all this dark magic like a magnet. Faith smiles, looks at the stars, then says that now they need to go home before it gets light. The sword asks him if he's going to take the Goblin King's ear. He was about to leave, and replies that he does not want to attract attention to himself. Then thinking, in the end, this deep at night, Faith leaves the dark thicket of the forest with a huge bag where the year of this Goblin King is located. Already on a bright day, where the sun is especially persistent and there are not so many clouds in the sky, the sounds of knocking are heard at the Roxy Heart estate surrounded by mountains and fields. There is one knock, then two knocks in a row. Faith wakes up. He's lying on his side, facing the window. He barely gets up. He goes to the door and then opens it. He rubs his eyes because they are sticking together from the fact that he obviously did not get enough sleep. He asks who is there. Suddenly, he sees Roxy Heart there. He already wakes up abruptly from such a surprise. Roxy Heart is standing in front of him with a basket full of some fruit that looks like green grapes. Roxy Heart is dressed in a knight's uniform. Her hair is loose. She first smiled at him, and then seriously asks how he feels, and then, as if finishing him off, calls him by name. Faith gets scared and slows down. He looks at his clothes and realizes that he fell asleep in his shirt. He doesn't know what to say to her. Roxy Heart is even more worried, and says, and in her opinion, he needs more rest. Faith is actively waving her hands again and says that he is fine. Roxy Heart's face shows that she is glad to hear this. She smiles at him, looks down and says she came to check on him. Besides, she brought him food. Roxy Heart says that these grapes were harvested at Heart Vineyards and that they were delivered this morning. They are juicy, green in color, so their fruits are definitely delicious. Faith asks if their land produces a lot of grapes and takes a basket of grapes from her hands. Roxy replies that it is, and it's a very beautiful place. Roxy Heart reaches out to the basket, plucks one grape from the vine. Then she hands it straight to Faith, saying that they are quite fresh. Faith begins to blush at such mercy and courtesy. He closes his mouth tightly, not knowing what to do. He does not refuse, but he does not immediately take these grapes into his mouth. He only says that they look very tasty. Roxy Heart, no doubt, just agrees with him. Their romance is spoiled by the maid who tells Roxy Heart that the time has come behind. Roxy Heart is a formidable woman in a maid's uniform and with glasses. Roxy Heart turns to her and convulsively says that she is already on her way. The maid turns away and leaves, followed by Roxy Heart herself. She turns her head to Faith, waves her hand and tells him to rest. Then she turns around remembering something important, and says that she plans to return to her lands, so she offers him to go with her together. Here, Faith remains in the hallway of the estate with her mouth wide open from shock. The door closes and Faith's face flushes with surging emotions. He reflects and comes to the conclusion that Roxy Hart is busy as usual, but he doesn't think that a commoner like him can help her in any way. But maybe if he becomes more important. He does not finish such a bright thought of his, quickly shakes his head, driving away unnecessary thoughts, and says that it is simply impossible. Then he stops abruptly and says that if you think about it, then it's his day off. He rejoices at the thought, clenching his fist. He comes to the city, to the shopping district. He is in a strictly classic suit, and with a sword at his hip, strolling down the street. Since it's still early, he decides to walk around the shops. First, he inspects all sorts of dishes. The assessment skill helps a lot in such situations. He picks up a large jug, examines it from different sides, puts it back in place. Suddenly, his gaze stops at the black skull mask lying on the table. Among other souvenirs next to her in a box are jewelry. Faith has an assessment of the thing. It is shown to him that his protection is 20, and in general, this mask hides the identity of the owner, so that he will be protected. The next moment, the seller is already thanking Faith for the purchase, and Faith himself happily leaves the counter holding this black skull mask in his hands. The sword notes that he has found something good. Faith agrees with him. It's for night hikes, but he hunts monsters almost every day. He wants to hide himself. One of the people is discussing. One asks if the other has heard of goblins. Then Faith immediately freezes in place. The second replies that they found a whole mountain of corpses. The first reports that the whole city is talking about it. His interlocutor adds that it looks like the work of some kind of monster. One of them heard that Hadsama from the Blalak family decided to subdue him. Faith turns abruptly as soon as she hears the name Balak. He remembers Raphael. Then he remembers all the situations related to this surname. Faith begins to get angry at these words about relief, thinking that they have no idea who they are at all. But then he realizes that this is the perfect alignment for him. Finally, he can figure everything out. His teeth are already creaking. He freezes again when he hears that this morning, someone planted the ears of the Demon King on the threshold of an orphanage in the slums, as if it were a donation. The second supports and is surprised. He imagines how the nuns found this ear on the threshold of their doors, how this little girl rejoices and laughs. The man says that he heard how the children eat their fill of delicious food. Then Faith, hearing this news, immediately smiles. A passerby says that this guide who threw up his ear is now being searched like crazy. He hopes that they will find him. Deep night covered with numerous stars. In the dark depths of the forest, murders are happening again. Faith jumps from the ground and attacks the goblin who, in a panic, does not know what to do. He freezes in place, only opening his mouth wide. Against the background of the moon, Faith's cloak and mask looks especially intimidating. He jumps straight at him with his sword raised, and cuts this goblin with ease. The next minute, he is sitting on a hollow tree, folding his hands in front of him, and sighing heavily. The sword says it looks like he's already used to the double life of a servant and a hunter. The guy replies that this is true. He did not want to starve again. He raises his head up and says that, besides, they don't know what Raphael and the others were doing. He remembers their faces and says that he is sure that they are up to something. He has not received new information for a long time. The sword tells him they're not stupid enough to leave footprints. Faith says he's right. He thinks and says, in the end, that in this case, he will just lure them out. Suddenly, he hears some sounds of footsteps and conversations. He turns his head sharply in the direction of the nose. He sees several knights, men walking through the forest. 3 goblins with weapons are standing in the background. These knights are trying to attack them in fear and horror. Faith gets up from her seat and notes that this is very convenient. He bypasses them from the other side, stops at one tree and watches their actions. One of the 3 tells the others not to be afraid of hobgoblins and then calls them rookies. The second, apparently angry, asks, and isn't he a rookie himself? The third one asks them to be quieter, because if they make a lot of noise, then a monster may appear, about which there are so many rumors. Those 2 agree. They pull out their weapons and shields, encouraging each other to shout that they need to go forward. The next second, they shout in chorus that they need to attack now and immediately attack all together on these goblins. The goblins wanted to turn their heads already, but someone else is ahead of the knights. They don't even have time to trace what it just was. They freeze in shock with their mouths open. Faith is standing in front of them in a terrifying mask, cloak and sword in his hands, and under them are dead goblins whom he killed with one swing of his sword. Fate jumps in the next moment and leaves the place, scaring those warriors even more. He hides in the thick of the forest, leaving them these dead goblins. Those three realize that the monster they were just talking about appeared right in front of them a second ago. They shout that this is the monster. Fate walks away from them and notes that it just turned out pretty well actually. The sword responds with approval and says that he is wearing a black cape with a hood and a bone mask, and that he has the appearance that befits a lick. Fate says that if you show up in public, sooner or later, they will appear. He remembers Raphael and his comrades again with insidious and cunning smiles that do not bode well. Suddenly, the sword shouts his name. He immediately stops and feels someone else's energy, which is dark in color. He feels that something is approaching him now at a very high speed. It's a goblin, presumably a woman. The sword immediately shouts to him that the danger is behind him. He turns around and sees a goblin woman who is furiously rushing towards him, ready to lead him astray. Faith recognizes the goblin queen in her and immediately starts running away from her. The sword tells Faith that something is wrong with her. The goblin queen looks like she's gone crazy. For some reason, nothing stops her. She's running towards him with her mouth open at great speed. In her hands, she has some kind of armband with a pendant. Then Faith realizes that this armband was on the Goblin King when he killed him. He realizes that she has come for him to avenge her husband. Faith stops and turns to face her. She swings and strikes with great force in the direction of Faith, who manages to bounce off the ground, thereby escaping from her blow. The Goblin Queen reacts very quickly to Faith's movements, so he immediately raises his head and prepares the next blow. As soon as she extends her arm with a punch, Faith, leaning on her own biceps, jumps even further away from her. They freeze for a second, looking at each other. The Goblin Queen becomes enraged and screams, raising her head up. She growls so loudly that the windows would break if they were nearby. Sword says that she is overcome by madness. He does not know what she can do, so he advises Faith to be careful. Faith confidently says that he sees no problems here with the new forces. He pushes off the ground, jumps high, even higher than the queen herself. The sword transforms into a bow. He shoots a magic arrow at the Goblin Queen in zero gravity. The arrow rushes straight to her and hits her right in the eye. She covers her eyes with her hands from the pain. Growling louder and louder from the pain, Faith doesn't stop there. He jumps even higher and, before finally killing the Goblin Queen, tells her to excuse him. Blood flows from the queen's eye, but in the next second, she loses her appearance altogether and finally becomes a corpse. She falls lifeless on her back. Faith lands on the ground and tells her to say hello to her husband. He calmly leaves the place, but then he hears screams. He stops, turns to the nose and sees those three people running away from this place from fear and horror. He says, "It looks like they've spotted him again." The sword adds that Faith generally overdid it a little. Faith replies that it's even better for him, because this way they will attract the holy knights faster and force them to act. On a sunny and bright day, Faith works tirelessly. Several days have passed since then. He continues to lead a double life. During the day, he is a servant, and at night, he is a hunter. He stops digging, wipes off the sweat and exhales, still thinking that something. Nights continue to do nothing. He thinks that maybe he should seek advice from Mrs. Roxy Hart, but he has too little information on Raffle. Suddenly, he hears a sound. He sees Roxy Hart approaching the gate. Roxy Hart looks into the distance with a smile that interests her. Faith comes up to her and says that she looks completely different, and then asks why such a change. She hears his voice, turns to him, calls his name and says that he appeared just in time. She tells Faith that she has an errand for him. He asks what kind of assignment she, with a wide smile, raising her index finger up, says that this is a very important and top secret assignment. Faith is seriously surprised by Roxy Hart's statement. He asks what kind of assignment it is. If it is top secret, she reveals the essence and says that she is going to inspect the residence and he will go with her. She says this confidently, pointing at Faith with her index finger. Faith still doesn't understand what it means to inspect these residents. Roxy Hart suddenly comes too close to Faith, and covering her mouth with her palm, whispers that this is a top secret inspection. This is an investigation of how peasants live, and that understanding such things as an inherent duty of any holy knight here. Faith already screams that he did not expect anything less from her. He thinks that Roxy Hart's idea is a great idea, Roxy Hart says he will then accompany her. Then he returns to reality again. He doesn't even have time to react. Roxy Hart grabs him by the collar and drags him along. He says that he still has so much work to do in the garden. And Roxy Hart calms him down and says that she will sort everything out so he doesn't have to worry. So they find themselves on a street full of people where Roxy Hart is looking at some things with very great interest. Faith stands quietly behind her, thinking that, of course, he was dragged here, but this is the first time he has seen Mistress Roxy Hart smile like that. Usually she is always vigilant, but at heart, it seems, she remains an ordinary girl who wants to have a little fun. He thinks he should provide her with a proper escort. He asks what she's looking at. She turns to In and replies that she is looking at jewelry. She points to a beautiful jewelry box, a blue stone pendant next to it, the same pendant, but of a different design. And the stone looks like malachite. She adds that their price is also affordable, but as soon as she announces that the product costs only 1 silver coin, Faith almost faints. Suddenly, something catches Faith's eye. He asks Roxy Hart what it is. He points to the box with the stones. Roxy Hart replies that these are just not polished stones. Maybe there will be a gem inside, and maybe not. The seller hears their conversation and immediately picks them up, saying that it costs only 10 copper coins, and then asks if he wants to try his luck. Faith reflects that 10 is not the cheapest price. He looks at a joyful and happy Roxy Hart. He stretches out his hand to the stones and medley asks for forgiveness from the owner, because he can see where there is a stone and where there is not. He finally chooses one stone, hands it to Roxy Hart and says that it is a gift from him. Roxy Hart is very happy and even blushes a little. She asks if he is sure. He replies that it is as a thank you for everything. Faith turns to the seller and asks to give him a tool. But then Roxy Hart just breaks off a stone with her bare hands. She rejoices, because there really is a jewel inside. Faith and the salesman stand in shock, their eyes bulging. Roxy Hart happily lifts this blue stone to the sun and carefully examines it. Faith is watching her. Through the sun, this stone looks especially beautiful. The rays of the sun pass into each of its crystals, forming a new shape and trajectory of light. She turns to him and thanks him. She presses this stone to her chest and gently says that she will cherish this stone. Awkward Faith scratches her head and says she's glad she liked the gift. Thus this stone, for 10 coins, becomes something significant for both. They continue their walk. Roxy Hart asks him, "Child, if he really lost his mother." This boy is very small. His eyes are full of tears. He himself is clutching his shorts. He does not look up. It feels like a little more, and he will have a tantrum. Faith says it's really a problem. Roxy Hart says they can't leave him. She walks up to him and bends down. At first, she gently asks if she and her mother have separated somewhere here. The boy can't answer anything. She approaches him even more closely and begins to arrange an interrogation. She pours the poor boy with questions about what his mother looks like, what her features are. The next moment, the boy becomes hysterical. He cries just like a river, screaming very loudly. It is clear that he was more afraid of Roxy Hart herself than that he was lost. Roxy Hart, sensing that the holy knights apparently do not like the children, moves away and turns around. Standing with her back to them, Faith gets down to business. He immediately suggests just looking for his mom together. The boy stops crying, wipes his tears with his hands, and asks if they are really going to look for his mother. Faith smiles with all 32 teeth and assures that this is true, giving a thumbs up. The boy already begins to smile with joy that his mother will be found soon. So the three of them start looking for his mom. The boy goes hand in hand with Faith. They ask passers-by. One says, no. They think about where else to go and who else to ask, but then Faith's stomach starts to rumble. It's clear from the boy that he doesn't mind eating either. After a while, they are standing on the street and appetitiously eating meat on skewers. Roxy Hart is standing behind them and looks at these boys with love. Sunset is approaching. They are still searching. They eventually approach the fountain and conclude that her mom is nowhere to be found. The boy sits on the edge of the fountain and sadly lowers his head. Faith suggests it's better to continue the search tomorrow, because the sun is already setting. The boy starts crying again, calling for his mother. Roxy Hart holds out her hand to him and says that he will stay at her house today. She promises that tomorrow they will definitely find her. The boy does not take her hand. He is trembling all over. A second later, he becomes hysterical. and he sobs again, screaming and calling for his mother. Faith and Roxy Hart are uncomfortable with this. They can't calmly listen to a child crying. From afar, a voice is heard calling his son, his beau. Roxy Hart and Faith turn towards the voice. They see a woman running towards a beau. The beau sees his mother and happily gets up from the fountain and runs to meet her. Faith steps aside to let the boy pass. Next, Roxy Hart and Faith watch as mother and son reunite. Both of them shed tears. Faith says that's good. Roxy Hart agrees and says that she has already begun to worrying about what will happen next. Mother bows to Faith and Roxy Hart in gratitude. They leave. The little beau turns around and thanks them, calling them brother and sister. The beau waves to them, and Roxy Hart waves back. Faith says it looks like Roxy Hart has become attached. Roxy Hart turns to him. She smiles gently at him, which gives him peace of mind. Faith freezes and blushes again. He doesn't know what to say. Roxy Hart calmly asks him what it is. Faith abruptly turns away in a panic, saying that it's time to go back, otherwise he will fly. Roxy Hart understands what is going on, so she hurries up herself, calling Faith to go home as soon as possible. She is already running home, and Faith himself is following him. Suddenly, Roxy Hart says that there is news about what she has already said before. Then she says that he will accompany her next week. She says they will go there together with such a joyful smile. Faith blushes again and just agrees with her, saying that he would be happy to keep her company. In the carriage, Roxy Hart asks Faith if he didn't want to go with her. He raises his head and asks again. Roxy Hart can be heard from the street in the carriage saying that Faith looks depressed. Faith was thinking about Raphael and his comrades. Then he realizes that this is not the best time to think about them. Now, he should enjoy the trip with Mrs. Roxy. Finally, he answers her that, no, he's having a lot of fun. He heard that it's the grape harvest season, and the one that Roxy Hart treated him to recently was very tasty. Roxy Hart smiles and notices that Faith always starts talking about food. She turns her head to the window and says, looking at nature, that initially these lands were not suitable for viticulture. After several generations of work to improve the soil, together with the inhabitants, the land finally became rich and suitable. It is considered the heritage of the Hart family. Faith smiles and says, it's beautiful. Roxy Hart herself smiles back at him with a charming smile, with her eyes closed. Then she frowns a little and says that monsters have appeared that are aimed at the works of their works. Faith realized that she was talking about kobolds, which are vile creatures and which are beyond the teeth of an ordinary, average warrior. These kobolds look like werewolves. They have a strong herd consciousness, and they always act in groups because of their good sense of smell. It is impossible to catch them by surprise, so it is difficult to cope with them. Roxy Hart says that she returns to her native lands every year, partly in order to cope with this scourge, because this year is no exception. There is silence for a second, and this silence is destroyed by another rumbling of Faith's stomach. He's already ashamed to get caught every time Roxy Hart just laughs softly. Faith comes to the conclusion that the gluttony skill reacted to the kobolds. Then it turns out that the souls of simple goblins are no longer enough for him. While they are driving calmly and both in their thoughts, the cabman loudly shouts the name of Roxy Hart. Both of them, as if waking up from a deep sleep, react very sharply to noise. Roxy Hart immediately opens the carriage door and asks what happened. The driver freezes in fear and fright, afraid to say anything at all. Here, both Roxy Hart and Faith see the reason for this behavior. They can't believe that there are kobolds right on the road. They block their way in packs. They look like they are a little different from kobolds. They walk on all paws. Roxy Hart says that not kobolds, but airwolves who have chosen the local meadow. They showed up because they smelled their scent. Roxy Hart calls Faith by name and tells him to just step back. She slays them with a wave of her sword, saying that they are much weaker than kobolds. She jumps from side to side, causing the wolves to lose their vigilance. The next second, a sword is stabbed into the head of one of these wolves. She removes the sword from the valve, and single-handedly coped with the entire pack of wolves. All this time, Faith stood behind and watched. He is delighted, which is to be expected. In his opinion, she does not bear the name of the Holy Knight for nothing. They finally arrive at their destination. Roxy Hart tells everyone that she's back. They are standing at a large house with a red roof. An attractive woman comes out to them. She is accompanied by a maid holding her hand. This woman congratulates Roxy Hart on her return. This is Roxy Hart mom. The girl is angry because she told her that it was not necessary to meet her like that. Roxy Hart's mother says she feels just fine. Then she looks at Faith and asks who this young man is. He immediately reacts and bows to her. Roxy Hart says it's their new maid. Faith gives his name and tells Roxy Hart's mother that he is glad to meet her. Roxy Hart's mother smiles and says it's mutual. Her name is Usha Hart. Faith thinks she is very kind. He has heard that she is suffering from a serious illness, but despite this, she looks pretty good and went out to meet them. Suddenly, Usha Hart immediately asks Faith if he likes Roxy Hart herself. Roxy Hart herself becomes uncomfortable, and Faith already coughs from such a surprise. Roxy already blushes from embarrassment and asks her mother what she is saying at all. Mom says that she wanted to find out if he likes the new mistress. Then Faith himself regains consciousness and realizes that she was asking in this sense. He says that he loves her very much, so much that he is ready to serve her for the rest of his days. He understands that their social status is too different, but at least as a servant, he thinks he is worthy of it. There is silence and he looks at Roxy Hart. He sees her all red as a tomato, very uncertainly and awkwardly, fingering her fingers. She is too shy to look him in the eye. Abruptly, she asks off and says that she will rest in her room for a while, and quickly leaves. Then Faith wonders if he said something wrong, not the reaction he probably expected. Then Usha tells him to take care of Roxy Hart, and then gently smiles at him. The sun is setting over the horizon. Her house is surrounded by mighty mountains, lots of greenery around fresh air. He goes home and thinks that while they were harvesting, he did not even have time to look back as the sun almost went down. He decides that he needs to get back soon. He looks up and sees some girl with a huge weapon that is even bigger than herself. Her shadow falls to the ground. She goes to meet him. Faith carefully examines her first. He pays attention to her weapon, and then the drones on her leg, and then her eyes, which are red. Faith was immediately worried. As soon as he saw those red eyes, he just watches her approach. He realizes that her eyes are the same as his. He tries to use the skill to see her characteristics, but he fails. A girl passes by and asks her to listen. She wanted to ask her a question. Then Faith is shocked that he can't see any data in his eyes. We see the reflection of this girl, her bright scarlet eyes. The girl asks him if he listens to her at all. He wakes up from his thoughts and asks the girl, in response, if he can help in any way. He tries to look absolutely calm, but his shifty eyes give him away. The girl says, no, he doesn't need any help. And then she says, it looks like it's still too early. Faith doesn't understand what she's talking about and why it's too early. The girl replies that she was chasing kobolds, but now she is giving them to him, so he now owes her. Faith doesn't know what she's talking about at all. The girl doesn't say anything and just walks past him. She throws him only a short wish to see you. Soon, Faith is left alone with her thoughts and questions. He sees her off for a long time. He's still thinking about her eyes and doesn't understand who she is. Remembering her eyes, he wonders if she is the same as him. He is awakened from his thoughts by the voice of Roxy Hart, who calls him by name. He turns to her and sees her. She runs up to him and says she was looking for him. She comes closer and asks if something has happened. Because he has such a strange face, as usual in his repertoire, he is actively waving his hands in front of him, smiling and quickly chattering that no nothing like happened and that everything is fine. Suddenly, her gaze moves away from him and stops at that girl. She is surprised. Roxy Hart calls her a gal and doesn't understand what she's doing here. Faith asks what kind of a gull this is. He thinks and understands that we are talking about the gulls. He now knows what they look like. He has heard about them. He tells Roxy Hart out loud that as far as he knows, there are practically none left. Roxy Hart fully confirms this idea that this is the case. She says that they lived on the continent of Gaul. They are characterized by dark skin and snow-white hair color. It's the first time she sees someone who would be so similar to them. Faith only listens to her attentively and adds short words to her statements. Roxy Hart suddenly says it's time for them to go back. Then she asks if he's tired. Faith says without hesitation that it is. He is really tired. They enter the house. The table is set. Very appetizing, fragrant, drinks are poured into glasses. Everyone has soup with meat in front of them, separate dishes for the second. Roxy Hart tells Faith it's time for dinner. He is only glad of it. He happily serves Mrs. Roxy Hart. First, Roxy Hart sits down and Faith stands awkwardly next to the table, not knowing where to sit. Roxy Hart points to the chair next to her and tells Faith that his place is right here. Faith wonders if he really belongs next to the mistress. He looks to the other servants for help, but they only voluntarily push him to his place. He tries to resist, but in the end, he's still sitting next to Roxy Hart. He sits awkwardly with his eyes on the floor. Roxy Hart herself looks at him with a smile. After a long silence, Roxy Hart turns to Faith and tells him not to worry about manners and eat plenty. He smiles broadly and thanks her for it. He begins to eat appetizingly, eating everything that is given to him. He already has crumbs on his face. Roxy Hart glances at him from time to time and just smiles when she sees him like this. After dinner, Faith follows the maid down the hall. She tells him that it's good that he came after all, because she hasn't seen Mrs. Roxy Hart so happy for a long time. He reflects that her father died in Gaul, and her mother, Usha Hart, is seriously ill. He comes to the conclusion that all he can do is serve Mistress Roxy Hart. A dark, deep night strewn with numerous stars. At this time, Faith goes hunting. He walks around the neighborhood and then tells his sword of greed, asking him to listen. Faith tells how she met a rather strange girl today, whom she and Roxy Hart later called a gal, and that she had the same red eyes. The sword answers him that it means there is something special about her. He believes that they will soon understand exactly what this feature is. Faith says that girl said something similar, too. He cannot understand what he will know in the near future. Finally, he starts hunting. He looks out of the bushes and sees two kobolds. These two kobolds are walking very clumsily along the row, unaware that they may be caught off guard from behind. He has an assessment of these enemies of his. He sees a young kobold who is level 25, but all his indicators are below 1000. His skills include strengthening physical parameters at the average level. Faith immediately found this skill so convenient. The sword supports him. After a couple of seconds, he first attacks one and immediately hits him in the back. The second one does not have time to react and tries to run away, but Faith menacingly shouts to him that he will not leave, after which he kills the second one. He didn't have time to do anything to protect himself. Two kobolds lie lifeless on the ground. Blood flows from them, and all this power and energy is absorbed into him. The system informs you that a new skill has been acquired. Faith wonders if it's just a couple of kobolds. He wonders if it's not enough for him. The sword suggests that apparently kobolds are afraid. Decides, tomorrow. Meccan finishes his thought. Faith stands holding the sword tightly in her hands. He feels like he has a bad feeling. He wonders if everything will be fine. He expresses the hope that nothing will happen to Mrs. Roxy Hart. It's hot outside. Faith tells her mistress that today is great weather for picking grapes. Roxy Hart is also happy about this and agrees with him. Next, Roxy Hart introduces Faith to the other workers. Faith looks awkward. The other workers are only too happy to meet him. After getting to know people, you should get to know the place and objects themselves. All the people are watching Faith as he barely lifts a basket of grapes. Roxy Hart is also watching him and smiles broadly at Faith's every action. So the day passes and the grape harvest. The sun goes into the order, and then night comes. Light and bright shades are replaced by dark and deep. The sky is enveloped by many stars. The sky turns blue where clouds are barely visible. Now everything is dark, and only the moon, with its weak light, illuminates the whole area. Faith starts her night life again. He walks again along that road flanked by trees with grapes. He is dressed in a black uniform, again with Greed's sword next to him. He says that tomorrow, Mistress Roxy Hart will go to kill kobolds. Greed tells him that he needs to eat as much as possible today, which Faith agrees with. He comes back to the area where he was the cliff of the mountain. There are two kobolds walking around again, awkwardly walking on their hind legs and looking around the whole area. The sword tells Faith that these are only scouts, so let him not kill them. Yet he offers to observe the situation. The sword believes that the main group will appear. The guy keeps watching, and then he sees a huge pack of wolves. At the head of them is a huge kobold with bright blue eyes on his neck. He has a chain of the Goblin King. In front of this kobold, there are many small kobolds that are several times smaller than him, and their eyes are red. They all walk calmly, looking at the terrain. Faith points to the one with the blue eyes and says that this kobold is quite large. Here, The sword itself suggests that he is undoubtedly crowned. Faith doesn't understand and asks again. The sword replies that it's a monster with a unique name, and it's easier to take a look for yourself. Once he tells him to use the assessment skill, Faith obeys him, and this huge kobold is evaluated. He is called the Mourner. He is an assault kobold at level 50. The characteristics of it are very high. Faith is just shocked that this monster has 6-digit numbers. The sword says that they cannot be launched into possession. If they are not stopped, they will trample everything in their path. The army looks especially dangerous. Kobolds of small size are coming from the front, but their eyes are burning like the boss, who is bigger and stronger than them at times. This boss comes from behind them. He immediately uses a magic arrow, which is now not golden in color, but such a purple one. He pulls an arrow and shoots it straight into the flock. This flying arrow hits one of the kobolds. He falls back screaming. Others look around in panic, trying to find the culprit. Their boss starts howling and growling, saying something to his subjects. The sword explains to Faith that he is now giving them orders. He sees and agrees, and that it seems this chief is very careful. He has an evaluation of the 2 kobolds in front of him. They have the same characteristics. They are assault kobolds at level 40 with less stamina than the boss. The sword warns him that they are coming. He gets up from his seat and realizes that he needs to change his location and ambush them. Faith obeys the sword and changes her location. He used to sit in the bushes, but now he is hiding behind a huge piece of stone. He looks out and watches one wolf. In the next second, Faith jumps and attacks this monster with her sword, cutting its body. Another wolf notices this and immediately shouts to others. The sword immediately transforms into a bow, and he shoots an arrow, as if he will allow the wolf to have time to communicate something to others. This arrow hits the wolf right in the back. Faith's gluttony is immediately activated. The system reports that a new skill of agility at the average level has now been obtained. Suddenly, Faith's eyes bulge out. He examines his body and rejoices, feeling such a surge of strength. It seems that the gluttony skill is now delighted. He looks at his current status and sees 6-digit numbers of his characteristics. His stamina, strength, magic, spirit, and agility have grown significantly. He gets ready and decides that it's time to greet the king. He holds the bow tightly and tells this king to choke on it. He prepares and shoots a magic arrow at the king. But the arrow stops because it is caught by the kobold king himself. He turns to him. Faith knew right away that there was going to be trouble. The kobold king begins to howl loudly and long. All the other wolves pay attention to him. The sword tells Faith that their location has now been revealed. He is wary. The guy notices that a huge number of wolves are coming to him with bloodthirsty and evil eyes. Greed tells Faith that they are at a disadvantage. He asks what they will do now. Will they really retreat? Faith thinks for a second. Remembering all the workers, he comes to the conclusion that he does not want to lose his home. So he tells Greed that they will do it now. The guy also remembered the smiling, happy face of Roxy Harp. The sword says to reduce their livestock, avoiding the leader, absorbing young kobolds. He will continue to strengthen his parameters. Faith just yells at him in response. With a shout that he knows himself, Faith shoots several arrows at once. They all fly in a certain direction, as if looking for their new victim. Arrows hit each wolf in the head. They do not have time to react because the arrow is directed towards them. Faith has killed many, but it's still too little. Faith still shoots an arrow and tells him, it's just easy to say. His arrows hit the wolves. In turn, they all die. However, the kobold king holds the arrow, standing quietly and waiting for Faith's next move. Faith realizes that he doesn't seem to mind frontal attacks. He doesn't have time to think anything at all, because he hears a long howl and a huge flock of monsters approaching him in a crowd. He holds the sword tightly and prepares to attack. And the next second, he hits the monster in the chest with the sword. He also kills the next monster and it falls near the king. The kobold king is howling in rage at the whole forest. He sharply attacks Faith with his paw and hits him in the shoulder. Blood flows from Faith's shoulder. He does not have time to move away from the blow. Then he walks away from the king's second blow, runs past him, and attacks another wolf who was standing behind the king. Faith kills him as well. While he was absorbing the forces of the slain wolf, the huge paw of the kobold king raises of him. He manages to turn around and see the attack, but does not have time to move away. This paw hits him. That Faith flies far back until it hits a huge rock. He is surprised by such power coming from the blows of this kobold king. Faith hits his back hard against the stone. He coughs. Some liquid immediately begins to flow from his mouth. The kobold king stands in front of him. A terrible, dark force of red color emanates from him. He slowly approaches him. At such a terrible moment, Grid tells Faith to hold on. The blow goes to the stone because Faith manages to slip away. He writhes in pain and lies down on the ground, continues to think about such an incredible destructive force. The sword is lying next to him. An ordinary kobold approaches Faith and puts his foot on his stomach, which takes Faith's breath away. He finds the strength and firmly takes hold of the kobold's leg and tears it off just from the owner. The limb is bleeding. The wolf is singing in pain. Everything is bleeding. Faith gets up and picks up his sword. He stands on this wolf without one leg and pierces his sword right into his chest. He immediately activates gluttony. Then the following characteristics appear: endurance, strength, magic, spirit, dexterity, and his skills were also highlighted. He rejoices that he has now bypassed this crown one. There are only a few subordinate kobolds left, only 5. They are all standing behind their king, whose eyes are burning with a thirst to kill Faith. We are shown the characteristics of both participants in the battle, Faith and the kobold king. It is noticeable that Faith has more characteristics than the king, although in the beginning it was the opposite. Faith feels such a strong aura of hatred from this king that he already has goosebumps. The sword tells him to get ready, because if he relaxes, he can be killed right away. Faith stands up and replies that he understands this. While he was trying to concentrate, the opponent covered the distance between them in a matter of seconds. He starts to panic, but manages to jump away from the blow of this king whose every action is accompanied by this dark aura of death and bloodlust. Faith realizes again what a powerful attack he has. Faith starts to run away from him. The monster calmly follows him. Faith thinks that no matter how much he surpasses him in parameters, the difference in combat experience is on the face. The kobold knows how to finish off his prey. The blow was clearly not ordinary. While he was thinking and remembering his blows, the sword prompts him to look at his skills. The system shows a window where the skills of this goblin king include hand-to-hand combat, which significantly increases the attack power in close combat with bare hands. Faith focuses on the blow and realizes what kind of attack he just had. He doesn't understand how to defeat him. He's already grinding his teeth, thinking hard about what he should do. The sword tells him to pick up the bow again. He asks why. All of a sudden, the sword hurries him and tells him to act faster, otherwise he will die. The sword turns into a bow, and Faith says he's always impatient. He shoots an arrow at the kobold king, but he takes the blow not with his body, but with another kobold. This wolf dies as soon as he gets this arrow right in his chest. Faith shouts that the bow is useless, and then we add that the melee is too dangerous. The bow tells him that if he is serious, he will erase it with one blow. Faith shouts at him in a panic to stop putting on airs, and asks what he should do. Grid tells him that he will release the bow's power, but then Faith has to feed him his stats. Faith wonders if it will happen again, and then asks how much he will need. This time, the sword says they will converge on 10%. After these words, the kobold king quickly runs to Faith to catch him off guard. In a matter of seconds, he's right in front of him. Faith immediately agrees with Grid and shouts to act. He answers him that it's wonderful that he decided so. The next second, he thanks Faith for the treat. Grid absorbs all the blood and power. A transformation takes place. Now he looks like both a bow and a sword. He now surpasses the height of Faith himself. A different energy is now emanating from this huge weapon. This blue fire that emanates from him speaks of majesty and power. Faith admires him. Grid tells him that this is not the time to just stand with a stupid face. Let him show him this kobold king what real power is. Faith, with a loud cry, pulls an arrow and shoots it straight at the kobold king. This arrow hits him right through the chest that he makes an incomprehensible sound and explodes. Everything around sparkles from the explosion. The brightness of the arrow is immeasurable. Faith is glad that he did it. He lowers the bow and calms down when suddenly unbearable pain overtakes him. He's screaming hysterically, not knowing what's going on. He feels as if his whole body is being torn apart. The condition of the gluttony skill has worsened due to the fact that they ate such a strong soul. And if Faith does not cope with this, then he will fall into a state that does not look like a frenzy. Grid tells him to hold on, otherwise he'll go completely insane. Faith grabs her throat and lets out mute screams of pain. He says, "Not to lose consciousness, to keep yourself." He plummets to the ground right face down. He holds onto the ground tightly, clinging to the soil, trying to vent his pain. He tries to get up from the ground, and first raises his power. All this, everything turns red, as if so much blood has been spilled that covers the entire area. Gluttony is activated in him, characteristic points are obtained. Also received a new skill, melee. Faith is breathing heavily, he says, coming to himself that this is the first time he has experienced this. He rubs his chin and Grid says that he has gained invaluable experience. Faith, greatly exhausted by the surging pain, says that it will be fine if he does not need it. Suddenly, Faith notices something and is surprised. Her mouth wide open, he asks the sore if he has overdone it too much. He sees how a piece of land is simply erased. There is a mess around, tree branches on the ground torn off during the battle. Grid tells him not to pay attention, because the victory must be crushing. Next, Faith sees how the mountain is cut. There is now a huge hole in the middle of this wall. Faith is worried because there will be a fuss in the morning. On a bright day, dozens of people are standing at the estate of Miss Asia Hart. They're all standing not far from that fountain. A confident Roxy Hart, in the form of a holy knight, says it's time for them to get down to business. They apparently go to kill kobolds protecting their crops. Meanwhile, Faith is lying in her room in a warm crib, yawning and trying to wake up. He first opens his eyes and then abruptly stands up, shouting that he was late again. He pulls the blanket away from him and quickly gets up with the thought that no matter how tired he is, he cannot disgrace the honor of who brought him here. He barely dressed, leaves his apartment running. The maid meets him, saying that their dormouse has finally woken up. Faith calls her by the name of Maya and asks her for forgiveness. He asks where his mistress, Roxy Hart. The maid replies that she said yesterday that she would take the most skilled warriors and go hunting for kobolds. Faith immediately gets upset because he also wanted to go. The maid smiles at him and says that Mistress Roxy has instructed him not to disturb his sleep, so let him not worry. Faith is not satisfied with this. He believes that it is wrong. After all, if only he will sit idly by. The maid was worried about such a statement. She is surprised. Faith says he's sure he can help in some way. He will certainly help about himself, of course. He's worried about yesterday, but his feelings are sincere. The maid, after listening to him, says that if he goes right now, he will probably catch up Faith without wasting a minute, says that he is understood and that then he will not waste time. He runs, catching up with them. Someone says his name. He runs towards him without stopping. His breath is knocked out, but he does not stop, even to take a break. He sees Roxy Hart commanding all the people. He sees all the workers cleaning up. She suddenly turns her head and sees Faith. She asks him what he's doing here at all. He scratches the back of his head and stammers that the maid told him everything, so he came to her. Roxy is worried and says that kobolds are dangerous. He realized this himself the other day. He says he knows, but he can't sit out in safety when they risk themselves. He does not voice his thought. He sees how Roxy Hart begins to blush and feels shy in his eyes. She is strewn with flowers because she radiates such an atmosphere. In his head, he utters the thought that, besides, he will not rest until he helps them at least a little. Roxy Hart pauses, not knowing where to put her red face like a tomato. Then Faith draws attention to the mess that he caused at night. He decides that Roxy shouldn't know about his skill, because he doesn't want to lose his newfound home. Then he pretends that he doesn't know anything, and asks her what happened here. Roxy Hart says that they found this place like this when they came here. Faith tries to ask a question: who could have done it? Roxy Hart sharply replies that she does not know, but what they know for sure is that someone has dealt with a pack of kobolds. Then she voices her thought, or suggestion. She thinks that that gal could have done it. Faith immediately becomes alert and remembers that girl. Roxy Hart says that the Gauls are a strong and warlike people, and from this girl, there was a smell of blood at all. She assumes that it was her. Faith thinks about it and comes to the conclusion that it seems this girl helped him out. Roxy Hart adds that this is just her theory, because no one from the locals is capable of such a thing. Faith remembers how this girl turned to him, looked at him with her scarlet eyes and told him goodbye. Faith thinks that if they meet again, he will definitely repay her. It's getting close to evening. The sun goes into the order again, illuminating Asha Hart's house and golden shades. They enter the house and in the hallway, Roxy Hart tells Faith to have a good rest. Faith obeys her and thanks Roxy Hart. Roxy Hart notices that his help was very helpful. She thanks him for his help. She is in the eyes of Faith again, and flowers. Faith tells her that it's not worth the thanks and goes to her room. On the way, she meets Roxy Hart's mother in the hallway. She recognizes him and calls him by name. A maid is standing next to her, helping her move around calmly. Faith is surprised and asks her if she's sure she should have gotten up. She laughs and says that this is true. She feels just fine. Then after a short silence, Usha Hart asks Faith if he would mind talking to her for a while. He says that, of course, he will talk to her even with Joe. They follow to Usha Hart's chambers. She herself is lying in bed, and Faith is sitting next to her on a chair. Usha Hart looks out the window as if looking out there for something. Then she says, without preamble, that she won't last long, and that even now her speech is interrupted by her hard cough. She lowers her gaze and says, if he knows she's so worried about Roxy Hart, Faith just calls her mistress and freezes. He thinks to himself that this is not surprising. He is torn from his thoughts. By the way, Usha Hart says that in the near future, she can say this with confidence because she knows herself perfectly well. Concerned Faith asks her why she is telling him about this with a soft smile. Says that this is all because she believes that he can support her daughter. She says that when her father died, she could not move away for a long time, and when she will also be gone without finishing. She adds that when he is around, she looks happy. Faith thinks to himself that no matter how much he supports Mistress Roxy Hart from the shadows, with the help of a skill, it feels somehow wrong for him. He is interrupted from his thoughts by the touch of Roxy Hart's mother's hand. And then he reads the thoughts that everything is fine and that it is not at all as difficult as you might think. Usha Hart smiles and says out loud that social status doesn't matter, and he doesn't have to be a holy knight at all. She points to his chest, where his heart is, and says that the most important thing is here, namely his heart, his soul. Faith thinks about it and freezes in shock. Usha asks him to take care of Roxy. She informs him that she believes in him. Faith lowers her eyes and wonders if she is worthy of taking on such an important role. In the dead of night, in the dark, thick of the forest, some holy knights in armor are hunting monsters. One of them is interested in how many they will be able to kill today. The second says that he bought a new sword, so you need to hunt decently to work it out. But the next minute, they are hunting, but kills the goblins the other. Their heads are flying one after the other. The green grass is stained with goblin blood. They freeze in place from fear. The corpses of goblins lie dead. They see goblins lying lifeless on the grass, bleeding. They don't understand what's going on here. They see a man in a raincoat standing on a mountain of corpses. They call him a lick. They see his face, which is covered with a black mask, and his eyes sparkle with scarlet blood. They shout that a certain dead man has returned. They return to the capital with a bunch of boxes, presumably full of grapes. Faith drags the crates to the building and sees Roxy Hart, who is dressed in knight's armor. He already freezes halfway. He wonders if Mrs. Roxy Hart is heading to the castle, because it's so soon after returning, because there was no time to rest. Suddenly, the box he was holding in his hands began to fall apart. The fruit inside it fell down, and the box broke completely to pieces. Then he realizes that he screwed up. A certain woman approaches him and asks what happened. He awkwardly apologizes and says that he just dropped the box. He didn't even understand how it happened. At first, the fruit is now lying on the ground among the wooden pieces. The woman asks him if he is hurt. He replies that he is not hurt and that everything is fine. Faith clenches his fist and hugs him. He is touched by the fact that despite the fact that he is to blame for this, they are so worried about him. The rumbling of his stomach gives him away. That woman hears this, smiles, a charming smile, and asks if he is already hungry. He scratches his head and laughs nervously and then makes excuses that, after all, when a person moves, he wants to eat even more often. Again that night, the sounds of dying goblins are heard. Faith is once again dealing with them. Dead goblins lie on the fresh green grass, staining them with their blood. Grid tells him that, probably because the skill has tasted the soul of the crown kobold, and now making do with ordinary goblins is not an option for him. Faith says he hunts and satisfies his hunger, then everything should be fine. Grid says that if he continues to starve, it will not lead to anything good. He takes off his mask and then raises his sword to look in the reflection. He is terrified, One of his eyes glows brighter than the blood moo. The sword immediately says that this is an intermediate stage of starvation and that this is the same state of exhaustion as now close. Nothing good is coming to him now. Faith clutches the sword tightly and wearily frustrated. Lowers her eyes down. Grit like a bell. Tells him to think about what he is going to do with it at all. It's getting light. The night has gone pretty smoothly. Faith is still working in the garden. He's carrying boxes of tools. One of his eyes is tied with a white bandage. His workmate asks what happened to his face. He scratches the back of his head and says that he just hurt his eye sleepily. Adds that it's nothing terrible. The worker points to one tree and says that it is now under the care of Faith, and then he himself will go to another tree. Faith smiles radiantly and says that everything will be done. He stands and cuts a large tree with large scissors. He thinks in the process that he will not be fed by goblins alone, and the eye is proof of that. By continuing to hunt them, he won't be able to saturate the skill. He remembers the reflection of his red eye on the sword against the background of numerous goblin corpses bleeding. He droops after the memories, but then his attention is attracted by Roxy Hart. He wonders if she has really returned from the castle. It's not easy to spend time like this. Faith follows the direction where Roxy Hart is going and realizes that she is going to her father's grave. She stands in front of his grave with her head down and her fingers folded. The wind pleasantly blows her loose hair. Faith looks out of the tree and looks at her. She feels someone's presence and calls him by name. He immediately shudders. Roxy Hart approaches him and asks if he is working in the garden today, and then notices that something is wrong with his face and asks what happened to his eyes. The guy replies that nothing happened and that he just hurt himself. Sleepily, Roxy Hart's face expresses concern. She clarifies exactly if everything is fine with him. There is silence. Faith does not answer her. Having gained strength, he asks if something has happened to her. After the silence, Faith justifies her question by saying that she's just not like usual. She replies that nothing happened, and then says that he will fly from the gardener. Faith reflects and comes to the conclusion that everyone is smiling here, and the woman who helped him when he dropped the box and the gardener. Everything here seems to be shrouded in an aura of goodness. And not only the aura, this beautiful garden is all blooming. Bushes again and again give beautiful flowers. Trees grow standing firmly on the roots. Everyone loves Mrs. Asia and Mrs. Roxy. In the town, in an ordinary institution, they talk about the same topic. One at the table asks if the others have heard that the dead man has reappeared, and that it looks like Mr. Haydu from the Blalock family will go for his head tonight. The second is surprised that the Holy Knights will finally begin to act. He is sure that they will figure it out. They agree with him and say that they did not want to become a victim of a dead man. Faith himself is sitting in the same room with them and attentively listens to their story. He has no idea what they are up to, but he will certainly get an answer from them. He remembers how the three of them suspiciously disappeared around the corner. They walked quietly, creeping up and looking around again and again so that no one would follow them. A crowd of warriors gathered at the south gate. The wall is in the moonlight. Their street is illuminated by huge torches with a fire that does not go out. The warriors are standing in groups and actively discussing something. We are shown one warrior with blonde hair and matching the color of his eyes. His face expresses the full seriousness and determination of what he is going to do. Now other warriors communicate. One attracts the attention of the other, saying that somewhere there really, Zaheda II is convinced that the rumors were true. Among them, there is a woman with bows. A headscarf is thrown over her head. People are actively discussing the upcoming battle, but someone is sure that Haydu cannot even cope with such a number. Someone runs up to this blonde-haired Haydu and says that a squad of scouts reported that they found goblin corpses in the depths of the forest. Haydu says it means the rumors weren't lying. The one who ran up answers him that everything is so. This Haydu turns out to be one of the three, together with the girl and Raphael. He remembers Raphael telling him they were going on an expedition to a mountain town, so he tells Haydu to keep an eye on everything here. Haydu thinks that he cannot disgrace the honor of the Blair family. He shouts to everyone to move into the thick of the forest, and he confidently thinks that he can cope with this dead man himself. They all crowd into the forest and see a bunch of goblins killed. One says how much gold is being lost. Another warrior agrees with him and offers him to get his hands on it, while Mr. Haydu does not see it. Tonight, the sky full of stars. Faith is sitting in a hollow in the thick of the forest, as if waiting for someone. The warrior who saw him shouts, Mr. Heidu says that someone is there pointing his finger at Faith. Heidu gives everyone the command to stop and asks if this is really the dead man. Someone confirms this, saying that this is so judging by the available information. Someone says, looking Faith up and down, that it is undoubtedly him. Someone from the crowd is nervous and says that he is more than sure that the Goblin King was here before he is even afraid to ask if he has defeated him too. Heidu laughs and says that he didn't even notice them. Then where is the Goblin King? He says that all this is just nonsense. Heidu gives everyone an order to surround him and that they will all attack him at once. At his signal, they all run to their places and concentrate. They all hide behind the trees and keep a close eye on Faith, while he sits quite calmly and does not even suspect anything, which can be told from his external behavior. Heidu smiles and says that by defeating the second-rate monster, he will significantly strengthen his social status. It will be so easy for him. In his opinion, he lets go of his hand sharply down, giving everyone the command to attack, and inside he maliciously shouts at him to get it in full. Everyone is shooting arrows at him at the same time. Arrows fly towards him from all sides, but stop halfway, because with one swing of the sword, he cuts off all the arrows. Everyone freezes in shock and does nothing. Hud is thinking hard, is he really lucky? He is sure that he undoubtedly heard the launch of arrows. Someone else gives the command that everyone surround him because he still has nowhere to run. They all surround him and pull out their swords. Fate is sitting on a hollow tree with his legs tucked under him. Heidu thinks this dead man is afraid of him. Then he shouts to him that he, the Holy Knight, Heidu will overcome him, the violator of their peace. Everyone laughs. Someone adds that when a whole Holy Knight looks at him, he will immediately surrender without resistance. They support him, laugh and say that this is natural. Someone in the crowd tells Heidu that he doesn't need to get his hands dirty on him so he can rely on them. Heidu is not against such a thought. He agrees and gives everyone the command to proceed. Everyone says that his order will be executed. He tells his team to show what they are worth, but then in a split second, Faith hits one next to Hyde, who flies off at high speed without having time to do anything. Heidu freezes in shock because he sees a dead man in front of him. Faith raises his hand in front of him. In the next split second, all those who are preparing to attack him also fly away and get injured from Faith's defense. One man was hit in the forehead, so blood is flowing from his head, and the rest are lying on the ground screaming and moaning in pain. With broken limbs, they pitifully stretch out in a spasm that they are in great pain. Those warriors, who were eager for battle, as soon as they saw how the beaten ones were struck, immediately run away from the forest. Heidu sees this and shouts, giving an order that they do not run away. He turns and sees Faith walking calmly towards him. His cloak spreads out in the wind. His mask is frightening. Heidu starts screaming in a panic, but how dare he make a fool of him at all, and that he will never forgive him for this, and calls Faith a monster. Faith says that this moment has finally come. Heidu freezes when he hears his voice. It seems to him that he has already heard this voice. In the next second, Faith throws off the mask and cloak very apically. So Faith appears in front of him with one blue eye and the other red. Heidu stammers and says it can't be. Faith calmly says that he no longer hoped that this would ever happen. Heidu raises his sword and asks why a man like him is here, and in general, what all this means. Faith says he doesn't need to tell everything. Heidu is furious at such treatment. Faith says that he should not even wait for an easy death otherwise, because he will get answers anyway. Heidu sends him out of anger and asks who he thinks he is, and actually he is Heidu from the Blarick family, a holy knight, so he will wipe Faith into powder. Faith pulls out her sword and then offers him to check it out in practice. He tells him to show him what the power of the holy knight is worth. Faith remembers a little girl with pink hair. He won't let him leave alive, because it's all for the sake of the people, for the sake of Mrs. Roxy Hart. If she had known what was going on at all, she would undoubtedly have been saddened. According to Faith, that he has already made a decision. He will take full responsibility and devour the seed of corruption sown by himself. His eyes burn with confidence and anger. Heidu takes a dubious pose to attack. Faith stands confidently in front of him. Heidu stands in front of him with one foot behind him and the other in front of him. He holds his holy sword in one hand and the other hand is behind him. He does not think to grasp his sword any tighter. Faith has an evaluation of the opponent. He did not expect anything less from the knight. He also has 6-digit numbers and skills include the possession of a holy sword, a great gain. Heidu provokes him by asking why he is frozen. His facial expression says that he is in fear, but he wants to provoke Faith out of himself, which does not work. Faith ponders what is more important, his skill with the holy sword. Probably this is the same thing he heard in one of the eateries. Rumor, if the holy knight has a holy sword with him, then he will not lose because the holy sword is the personal weapon of the holy knight. It seems that each of them is made to order. They discussed it violently. One says that they are forged from a rare metal. He heard that the Great Cross is the most powerful technique of such sorts. After the flashbacks, he asks Grit, pointing to Hadu's sword, how dangerous it is. Grit is already offended. He asks if he really thinks that he can give in to a pathetic parody. He sets the mood of the battle, telling him to go ahead and with a song. Faith already exhales and takes a firm pose again, because in this case, he has nothing to worry about. Hadu still can't calm down. He mentally calls him a simpleton and confidently plots that he is going to die from his sword. He pushes off from the ground and shouting for him to see the technique of the holy sword, which he calls the Great Cross, attacks him with the desire that it turn everything into dust cleansing light. Faith exhales boringly, as if he's about to yawn. And the next second, he's right behind Hadu and tells him briefly that it's all too slow. Hadu doesn't even have time to turn to the Vos and say something as he gets hit. Faith confidently says that Hadu lost to him for 3 reasons. Hadu doesn't even have time to raise his sword as Faith takes and just cuts this holy sword into pieces. Hadu looks at his sword in shock and does not understand how his sword could break like that. Faith holds the other half of the sword in his hands. Then he throws this remainder back to Hadu and asks why he is throwing it around then, so let him take it back. This remnant of the sword will hit right into Hadu's shoulder. He screams furiously in pain. Lies down on the ground, twitching and moving from side to side, moaning and screaming that he is in pain. Fate takes Hadu by the neck and lifts him up, saying that it is not good for a holy knight to roll on the ground. He orders him to stand up, holding him by the neck. Faith says menacingly that she is starting Hadu's favorite activity, namely parenting. Hadu doesn't have time to say anything because of the lack of air. He just hiccups. Faith squeezes Hadu's throat tightly and walks through the trees with Hadu's body at high speed, which causes Hadu violent pain. He screams, begging him to stop. Faith finally stops and calls Hadu handsome because his face is now beaten and there are little twigs with leaves from trees in his hair. He asks him to stop it. Faith is angry. Is it really someone who has ruined more than one human life saying this? He remembers how they tortured him, how that little girl cried. He gets even angrier and asks how. He even turns his tongue to say such a thing. He squeezes him tightly and throws his body up into the sky with one swing. Faith orders Grid to take 30% of his stats and summons a bloody term again 3 times, besides telling him to try not to kill him. Grid is already happy and says that this is a generous treat, so he will easily arrange it. So he begins the transformation and executes his order. The shape of the sword changes. It becomes an even more powerful bow. It launches its arrow from Manhwa, aims up at Hadu. The next sight is very scary. The arrow flies around Hadu's body several times and deprives him of all limbs. He falls lifelessly to the ground, along with all his body parts, his eyes still open. He is alive because the characteristics of a holy knight allow him to live. Faith asks first of all, where Raffle and Memi are now. Hadu replies that they are currently on an expedition in the eastern mountain zone and that they will return only in 3 months. Then he gives him an order to tell him everything he knows about Mrs. Roxy Hart. He says heavily that tomorrow she will be ordered to go to Gaul. Here, Faith freezes in shock from misunderstanding. Do they really want to send her to the place where her father died? Hadu says that now the heavenly dragon of Gaul is expanding its territory. This happens for the first time in 1,000 years. Someone has to stop him. This victim was Roxy. We are shown a terrible red dragon of unprecedented size, which has sharp teeth and red eyes. Faith asks, so whose handiwork is this? Hadu says, it's not just their doing, because the other holy knights also took part. However, he didn't follow them. Faith asks if this was the content of their meeting when they suspiciously walked down the street and turned the corner. He hesitantly replies that this is so. Finally, he asks if Mrs. Roxy Hart has accepted it. He burns inwardly because it's the same as ordering him to go and die. He introduces little mistress, Roxy Hart, to this huge, dangerous dragon. Haedu replies to him that she could not resist. The decision was made unanimously. Faith remembers how Roxy Hart passed by the garden and immediately went to her father's grave when he still noticed something strange in her that did not look like her usually. Haedu says that Roxy Hart said that if her victim saved at least one resident, she would gladly give her life. Faith immediately imagined this phrase through Roxy's mouth. Then Haedu distracts him from his thoughts, saying that he has answered all his questions. He begs him not to kill him. He promises to change and will serve for the good of the people. Faith doesn't listen to him. He raises his sword and aims directly at his forehead. In the next second, blood is brutally spilled, and all the blood is absorbed back into Faith himself. Gluttony is activated. Now a new skill of the Great Cross is obtained. Saliva started coming out of his mouth abruptly for him to absorb the characteristics of a person like Haedu is not at all joyful. Grid tells him that the path to the second level is now open to him. Faith, immediately, as soon as she hears this, tells Grid to act. Grid says that it's so generous of him, and he replies that he wants to vomit from the very thought that there is a part of this person in him. Grid laughs and begins the transformation. Everything turns red and purple. His system window is now not red, but blue. He is now at the second level. His skills include agility at the middle level, regeneration, melee combat, and possession of the Holy Sword. Now he has a new weapon that has become even bigger and has acquired a new shape. Grid says it's a big scythe and that its cursed blade can cut through anything. Then he raises his head to the sky. He freezes in sadness and sadness again and again, remembering the words about Roxy Hart that she will go to certain death to the Red Dragon. In the deep darkness of Faith, someone is diligently calling by name, repeating the name over and over again. He turns around in the midst of this dark force and recognizes Mistress Roxy Hart. The following picture appears before him. Mrs. Roxy Hart is standing in front of the monster, but with her back to the dragon. Her face expresses fear and horror. Behind him, the monster conjures a ball of power on his palm, as if preparing to send it straight to Roxy Hart. Right now, everything is sparkling, as if there is some kind of explosion. He doesn't see anything. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is that Roxy Hart has been hit by this blow. After such a nightmare, Faith wakes up with horror, immediately screaming and calling for Mrs. Roxy Hart. He pauses for a second and begins to realize that it was a dream. Moonlight illuminates his room. He looks at himself and exhales with the thought that it was a dream. He lies back on his side, facing the window and thinks. Because it's still the middle of the night, he silently continues to lie in his thoughts and look out the window. The next second, he turns on his back and pulls his arms up that shirt, pulls revealing his stomach. He was tired of not being able to sleep on such nerves. Finally, he gets up, sits on the bed, and then looks at himself in the mirror and assumes that hunger seems to have receded. He continues to sit and wonder why she didn't tell him. Is it really impossible to rely on him here? Grid interrupts his thoughts, noticing that this is being said by someone who hides his identity himself. What kind of arrogance is there? And as if exhales, also tired of Faith's thoughts. Faith blushes and tells him to shut up. The sword tells him to just forget, because that's what fate has decreed. He then lies down on his back and continues to think that, however, there is no sense in this. Most likely Roxy Hart just doesn't want him to worry. Once again, his stomach just starts to rumble. He strokes his stomach and thinks that after zeroing out the characteristics he hunted goblins, but it seems that this is really not enough. Slowly, his eyes are closing. He wonders how long Mrs. Roxy Hardy will go to Gaul. He's worried about what will happen if she runs into a dragon. Grid says that he will teach him something important. A first-class warrior is someone who can rest in any situation. Given his torment, he is no more than a third-class warrior. Faith, as if offended, turns on her side towards the window with her back to the sword. The sword asks if he's offended, and if so, it's a pathetic sight. And he also calls himself the master of the Grid. Faith tells him to shut up again. Grid laughs and says that at least he cheered up a little. Faith doesn't say anything. Suddenly, Grid asks him if he hears that there is some kind of noise outside. He opens his eyes, abruptly. Only one thing comes to his mind. He gets up and abruptly opens the door and sees how the servants are agitated and upset. As the woman who helped her with the fruit has tears in her eyes, he starts running after her. He runs up to the place and sees how all the maids, as if heartbroken, surround Mistress Roxy. They all cover their mouths as if in horror or just a little more, and they will start crying. Roxy's heart turns to the sound and wishes Faith a good morning with a smile as if nothing had happened. Her face expresses gratitude and joy for this morning. Faith, as if knowing in advance what will happen, asks cautiously. He asks her what happened. She says that an order has come from the castle and she must send it to Gaul. Faith wants to shout to herself that she's not and that it's all because of them, these holy knights. Aloud, he tries to dissuade, warning that it is very dangerous there, because even her father. He does not finish his speech. Roxy's heart says with a smile that she understands everything perfectly. She also says that she must finish what her father once started. Roxy's heart just thanks. Faith against the background. Everyone no longer restraining themselves is crying with grief because they understand that this is the end. The sweet woman, her mate, and even the gardener in night pajamas is crying. Roxy's heart says she is happy that everyone is so worried about her. Faith is sure that Mrs. Roxy's heart kept silent to the last because she was afraid. Faith asks how long she will be in Gaul. She thinks about it and says that she will be there until she deals with all the hordes of monsters, and maybe it will take 3 years. Faith is horrified by such a period. He worries that in such a period, the heavenly dragon will certainly attack them. According to Heidu, he has already approached their borders more than once. The enemy of Mrs. Roxy's heart is a catastrophe in the flesh. No matter how strong a knight she is, she will certainly be killed. He imagines Roxy's heart in blood, and next to her a bloodthirsty dragon. Faith freezes in horror and fear as soon as he imagines it. Roxy's heart asks him not to make such a scary face. She assures that she will be fine. She puts her hand on her heart and says it all with a big smile. She tells him that while she is away, he can work on her land. Then she adds that the hands of the Blairs will certainly not reach there. He starts to say something Roxy's heart doesn't understand and asks what. He reflects that he cannot ask her to take him with her because he is a heretic who steals other people's characteristics and lives by it. He has no right even to stop her. Somehow, it shows that he is suffering, not knowing what to say and how to influence it. Roxy's heart removes the chain with the pendant from her neck, hands it to Faith and asks if he remembers him. The pendant is made in the form of a butterfly. The stones inside it are blue. Faith recognizes the butterfly and remembers how he gave her a stone that was not yet polished. How she broke this stone with her bare hands and was so happy about it. Roxy's heart tells him that she always wears it. She presents the chain back to her and asks with a smile if it suits her. He still, with sad eyes, tells her that it suits her. Roxy's heart smiles at him and tells her to see you. Soon after this short sentence, she turns away and leaves. Faith remains alone in this corridor and quietly wishes Mrs. Roxy's heart good luck. With lost hope, he quickly and abruptly runs to his room and changes into his black uniform. Grid says he seems to have already made up his mind. Faith prepares and says that this is true. He will go to Gaul with her, but not as a henchman, but as a warrior. He says he won't be able to reveal his identity to her, but he will protect the mistress. He puts on a mask. It's hard for him to say goodbye to those who cared about him so much. The maid, who seemed so scary and strict, suddenly lets Faith go, giving him some kind of bag for the road. Another man gives some bottles and Faith himself bows and thanks him. He needs to say goodbye so that they can return home with Mrs. Roxy's heart. He goes outside and bows to the gardener with whom he has been working all this time. He takes a backpack with him and sets off. He sees a cab passing through the gate. A lot of people gathered in the square. He looks around at the building where he was cared for, loved and given to eat. He looks at the whole heart estate with sadness. It seems to him that so much time has passed since he was a gatekeeper. He remembers how poor he is standing at the gate with a spear and a blue flag, hungry, dirty and tired. Now he is different. He turns to the Faith from the past, what he thinks about who he has become. A lot of things have changed since then, and now he goes to Gaul as a warrior. He had a lot of bitter memories. He remembers how he was offended by Raphael and his comrades, but he also had no less happy memories with Mrs. Roxy. He remembers how they walked, how he bought her a stone with cunning, how they found the child and gave it back all this day, which was intended to check how the peasants live. He says to wait until the meeting, if he ever comes back at all. He confidently steps forward to the Kaabas and adds to himself that he says goodbye until he returns. After a beautiful and fast sunset, when the whole area is enveloped by the golden rays of the sun, the night comes very quickly and mercilessly, full of stars, beauty and darkness. In a certain small house with small windows and doors, a father and son are sitting. There is a spear on the wall, which is stained with blood. Little Faith carefully imposes a bandage on his father's palm, twisting it to the sides, wrapping the bandage skillfully in different directions, so that the bandage holds tight. A man looks at him very warmly and tenderly. The boy calls him Daddy. He is a pure copy of his father. He has only stubble on his face, but otherwise, everything is the same. The boy announces that he is finished, and his father praises him and tells him that he is doing well. Faith tells him that it's because his father gets injured so often. His father just smiles radiantly at him, saying that he is definitely right. He pats Faith on the head and apologizes for it. He offers his son to go with him to say hello to his mother, who agrees and obeys his father. On a bright and hot day, leaving the house, they go along the path to the place. His house is surrounded by mountains, a lot of grass and greenery. There is still a lonely tree near the house. As a result, father and son come to the grave and leave flowers there. The grave is literally made of nothing. There is just a big lump of earth pierced by a cross made of wood. They stand and pray. Little Faith folds her hands in front of her face and asks her mother to protect her father. He closed his eyes very tightly, but then he opens his eyes and sees how Dad is praying hard that he is already getting sick. Sweat is flowing from him, and his teeth are clenched from tension. Little Faith tells his father not to cripple himself even more. He is sure that Mom will not be offended. Dad is surprised by this statement, but then says that he still wants to pray. Suddenly, he wakes up from the question, did he dream something good? He opens his eyes sluggishly, drooling from his mouth. He comes to himself abruptly and looks around. He is sitting on a wooden chair and driving somewhere. Faith exhales and looks at the open part of the carriage. He notes that they have already driven quite far away. A girl with beautiful golden hair sleeps in the carriage with him, and a father and son are sitting in front of him. The little boy is clearly happy about this trip. The leading carriage announces to its visitors that they will soon arrive in the city, which is called Tetra. The driver is a serious man with a short haircut. Faith hears the name of the city and thinks. As a result, they arrive in this city. He gets off the carriage. This city is full of houses with 3 floors. Everything is built neatly, and people walk around without any problems. Faith walks through the streets and notes that it is smaller in size compared to the capital, but it is still lively. People are actively engaged in their own affairs. He takes out some paper and opens it. He looks at the map of the cities. He sees that Gaul is much further south. He needs to find a suitable carriage. He asks passers-by, people, but they just refuse, shaking their heads. He didn't find any. The sun is already setting, so he will have to spend the night here. He walks through the streets and thinks, as far as he knows, Mrs. Roxy Hart hasn't even got here yet, so there's no point in him rushing at all. He takes 5 gold coins out of his pocket on the palm of his hand. He assumes that the boss realized that he was going after the mistress. He decides that he should spend them carefully. He had already been to this city once. He stopped on his way to the capital. Then he was hungry and literally dying. He clearly did not have time to admire the city. Then we are shown a little Faith, who, with confused and frightened eyes, did not know what to do. So he was sitting against the wall next to the barrels. Suddenly, his stomach rumbled again, and now he was hungry again. He realized that he needed to eat. He finds some place and goes there and sees that the tables are full of people. They are all sitting and enjoying their food and drinks. He goes straight to the bar, where it's pretty empty. The waiter greets and asks what he will have. He thinks about it and asks what he can advise him. The waiter says that the drink is a red drink and to eat is hare soup with bread, and all this will cost 20 coins. He asks what he will say to that. Faith's mood is deteriorating. You can see it on his face. He menacingly tells the waiter to stop cheating travelers. He firmly tells him that he will order only for 15 copper coins. The waiter was already nervous that then they came to a compromise. He turns around and sees half of the merchants and half of the warriors. Did they raise the price because of the solid appearance? He carefully examines the clothes of the visitors. He is asked to apologize for waiting. And dinner is brought, indeed, 2 rolls of bread that shine with butter, a glass of red drink and an appetizing soup with meat and vegetables. Faith thanks and claps her hands in front of her as if she wants to pray. He eats appetitiously and reflects that he will continue to travel south through major cities, so it is easier to get information than saturate his skill. Suddenly, He is distracted by a shout that someone has got someone. He turns around and sees man bowing on his knees in front of sitting people who indifferently ignore him. His eyes open wide as soon as he hears his words and plea to save his village from something. In front of his hands is a bag of coins. The warrior shouts at him that, because of the influence of Gaul, there is no end to extermination tasks. Now does he really hope that they will go to his village for such pennies? The man doesn't stop and begs them, because they are surrounded by monsters and that they need help. That warrior abruptly stands up and presses his foot on the head of this poor man. He arrogantly tells him then to ask, more sincerely, if he understands this. The man says that he conjures them and begs them to help. Everyone else starts laughing. As a result, the warrior removes his leg and says that, so be it. The man already gets up and rejoices whether he is telling the truth. The warrior says that they have business and offers to wait a year. Then the payment is 10 gold coins in advance. The man turned pale and asks where they got such money from, and a year later, it's too late. The warrior then tells him to look for someone else. The man freezes in horror, and again, accepts to beg them to help him. The warriors begin to get annoyed and shout, let him shut up and not spoil the atmosphere for them. He lifts the man by the scruff of the neck. The warrior swings and shouts that he doesn't care what happens in the hole. Suddenly, his punch stops, Faith holding his fist tightly. Faith tells the warrior to stop already. He gets mad and asks who else he is. If he gets in the way, then he will fly in here. Faith does not hold back and rings his fingers, twisting him in the opposite direction. The bald warrior is already shaking in pain. Faith asks him if he has understood. He tearfully asks for forgiveness and begs him to stop doing it. Faith lets go of his hand and is ordered to sit down and eat her soup in silence. Otherwise, he interferes with the others. The bald warrior, hesitantly and with fear, only obeys him. That table of arrogant warriors is now in no mood, and they sit silently eating their soup without making a sound or rustle. That man does not understand and wants to ask something, having previously asked for forgiveness, but his gaze stops and describes a kind of surprise mixed with fear. Faith calls him Seth, and says they haven't seen each other for a long time. It seems like 5 years. Faith's face expresses some kind of regret or nostalgia for the old days. Seth is shaking in complete shock. Eventually, he asks if it's really Faith. He stands in an awkward position. He behaves as if he has done something very wrong to Faith somewhere in the past. Faith only looks at him without emotion, although inside he remembers his past. At a young age, this bow viciously beat and threw stones at Faith. He covered himself with his hands, but the stones all fell into his head. This Seth screams and calls the poor bow Faith a freeloader, a slacker. He keeps taking stones from the ground, regardless of what size they are, and throws them. He begs him to stop. He keeps trying to beat off the stones with his hands, but only trembles tightly, closing his eyes. He's scared and in pain. Then we already see how his house is on fire. There is practically nothing left of the house. Little Faith is standing in front of the house itself and sobbing, not knowing what to do. Seth looks at Faith with great fear. He, having overcome and stepped over himself, falls to his knees again, lowering his head to the floor, begs Faith to help them. He tells Faith with complete regret that he will not ask him to leave the past in the past, but they really need his help. Faith thinks to herself, without answering him, that he is doing it now, even though he has done so much harm to him in the past. He called me all sorts of names. The fire was also the work of this guy Seth. Everything was burning, not only the house itself, but also the trees around the grass. Everything was in flames and smoke. He is still on his knees and forcefully says that he understands everything and is ready to do anything for his help. Faith looks at him indifferently for a few seconds and then comes to the conclusion that if he refuses, hardly anyone will agree to help him. He exhales with such fatigue and hopelessness. The village is being attacked by creepy monsters. They look like huge bats with horns on their heads and large wings. People can only scare them away, but not win. People suffer from these monsters. They run away from them in fear. They close their eyes tightly in horror and stretch out their hands looking for help in others. If these monsters attack again, then the village is over. This Seth is still kneeling in front of Faith. Faith thinks he still wanted to visit the graves of his parents. Decides he will feed the skill at the same time. He exhales heavily and finally agrees in a voice. He abruptly stands up pale and says a huge thank you to him. He wanted to offer him to go tomorrow morning. His words are cut off by Faith and says that they should go right now. He objects and does not understand how it is. Why now? Because it has been night for a long time. And besides, it is also a heavy fog. He explains this by saying that monsters will come running to their light. Faith asks indifferently, well, so what if they come themselves? Then it will be easier for him to figure it out. Seth is already frightened by such words and does not quite understand Faith. The sword tells Faith that he thinks this way because of the endless goblin hunt. He suggests that he remember the fight with the kobolds. Seth asks Faith if he's sure he wants to go now. Despite his warnings, Faith confidently replies that yes, but adds that they will go without light. Seth just listens to him and says that, so be it, it will be as Faith himself said. He clenches his fist and cheers, saying that he is the only warrior you can rely on. Faith laughs to himself with these words. What kind of warrior is he talking about at all? He assumes that probably in his eyes, he looks like that. Faith doesn't say anything to him. He wonders what happened. After all, they are in complete darkness among the mountains and fields. Faith is walking in front because of his skill and Seth is behind him because without light, he can't see anything. Faith thinks all the way. He thinks that this deer is so familiar. He remembers how he ran here headlong at such a thought. He already smiles. Abruptly, his thoughts are interrupted by a noise in the bushes. They both get scared and prepare to defend themselves. A large goblin jumps out of the bushes with a club in his hands. He's already attacking them with a big head, as if he caught something valuable. Faith immediately shouts to Seth to move away. He gets scared and freezes in place. Faith immediately opens her sword and cuts this goblin in one swing. This monster dies immediately, bleeding and staining all the greenery on the ground. Silence falls. Seth thanks Faith in surprise and admiration, and then he adds that he really has become strong. He clenches his fist, probably from nerves. Faith replies that for him, it's a mere trifle. For him, it's like everyday life. Seth reflects, remembering both the situation in the bar and scrolling through the moment of the goblin's attack. He realizes that this is clearly not a trifle. Faith says it doesn't matter in any way, so she suggests that we hurry up and go. Soon they pass through the fields and approach the forest. Faith hears birds singing. At first, he is alarmed, and then when he realizes that they are birds, he wonders if they really sing at such a late time. Seth is walking behind him. He looks pathetic and upset. He asks Faith to listen to him. He asks if he still hates their village. Faith stops abruptly as soon as she hears his question from the fact that he abruptly stopped walking. Seth himself is even scared. Faith tells him that it would be alive, she said otherwise, but still, his parents are buried there. And this is the most important thing for him. He confirms to himself that he really hates them. He justifies that it's all just for the sake of his parents. He remembers his father's bright smile when they lived together when he was alive. He still wonders how much the inhabitants of this village could have changed. Finally, they come to the village. They approach. Seth tells Faith that they have come. He explains that, first of all, they will go to his father. That is to their elder. He says he will try to explain everything to him. Faith turns and sees Seth bowing, begging to save them in his village. Faith thinks to herself that he has changed. He only remembers running away from him in fear and terror. It looks like his whole childhood was spent like this, in fear and cramping, which he experienced because of Seth. He thinks about what could have changed him, or maybe it happened.